Ethan Walker didn't knock on Margaret Hawthorne's door like a man asking for help. He knocked like a man who had already accepted that help wasn't coming. His daughter Emma hadn't eaten in 2 days. Her lips were cracked. Her eyes were glassy. She hadn't cried in hours, and that scared him more than anything, because children stop crying when they stop believing anyone will come. He held her against his chest, raised his fist, and knocked. He didn't know that single knock was about to change both their lives forever. If this story moves you, please subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss a story like this one. Drop a comment and tell us what city you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story has traveled. Your support means everything, and I promise you what happens next will stay with you long after this video ends. The summer of 1887 had no mercy in it. Montana territory burned under a sky so wide and pale it looked like the earth itself was exhausted. The grass along the road had gone yellow weeks ago. The creek beds Ethan passed were cracked mud and silence. Even the wind, when it moved at all, carried heat instead of relief, dry and flat, and indifferent the way certain kinds of grief feel after they've been with you long enough to stop hurting and just become the air you breathe. Ethan Walker had been riding since before dawn. His horse, a roan mare named Belle, that had been with him through everything, moved slower than she used to. She was tired in a way that rest no longer fixed, the kind of tired that settles into bones and stays. Ethan understood that feeling completely. Emma was asleep against his chest. She was 6 years old, and small for her age, had always been small, her mother used to say, but fierce. Clara used to say, Emma came into the world like she was arguing with it from the first breath. But Emma hadn't argued with anything in days. She lay still against him, her thin arms hanging loose, her breathing shallow in a way that made Ethan count each inhale and exhale like they were coins he couldn't afford to lose. He kept one hand on the reins and one arm wrapped around her. He had been doing that for so long, holding her while everything else slipped away, that he couldn't remember what his arms felt like when they weren't holding her. Clara had died 2 years ago. Fever, fast and brutal the way fevers were back then. 3 days from the first chill to the last breath, and Ethan had sat beside her through all of it, holding her hand and telling her everything was going to be fine, even as he watched her face go still. He had promised her things he wasn't sure he could deliver. He had told her Emma would be safe. He had told her Emma would have a good life. He had meant every word. He just hadn't known how hard keeping those words was going to be. Kansas had broken him first. The drought came the same spring. Clara died, which felt almost deliberate, like the land itself had decided to be finished with him at the same time the sickness had. The cattle thinned, the harvest failed. The bank held his mortgage and had no interest in sentiment, and the man who sat across from Ethan at the bank desk in Wichita had looked at him with the kind of polite pity that is worse than cruelty, because at least cruelty is honest. "Mr. Walker," the bankman had said, folding his hands on the desk, "we've extended your terms twice already. I'm afraid the property will have to be—" "I know what it has to be," Ethan had said. He didn't let the man finish. He stood up, put on his hat, and walked out. He had spent the next 2 years doing everything a man without land could do. He hired out as a ranch hand. He fixed fences. He hauled freight. He slept in barns and ate what people gave him and sent every extra coin he scraped together toward Emma's food and medicine. He left her with a neighbor woman in Dodge City, while he worked a decent woman named Mrs. Pruitt, who was kind to Emma, but made clear without ever saying it directly that the arrangement could not go on forever. "She needs her father," Mrs. Pruitt told him one Sunday in the spring. "I know," Ethan said. "She cries at night sometimes. She calls for you." He said nothing to that. There wasn't anything to say. He took Emma with him after that. He couldn't leave her again. He packed everything they owned into 2 saddlebags, which wasn't difficult because they didn't own much, and he rode north. He had heard about work in Montana. He had heard through the kind of loose talk that travels between ranch hands and freight haulers, and men who sleep under stars, about a widow north of Billings, who ran a cattle operation bigger than most men could manage alone. Hawthorne Ranch, they called it. Margaret Hawthorne's place. Some men said she was looking for help. Some men said she wasn't looking for anything and would run you off her land if you looked at her wrong. Opinions about Margaret Hawthorne. Ethan had discovered depended heavily on who was offering them. The men who had worked for her and been treated fairly spoke about her with a kind of careful respect, the way people talk about someone they've learned not to underestimate. The men who had never worked for her, or who had tried to take advantage of her and failed, called her cold. They called her unreasonable. One man at a saloon in Miles City had called her something worse, and Ethan had walked away from that conversation before he did something he'd regret. He had his daughter with him. He couldn't afford regrets, so he rode toward Hawthorne Ranch with nothing but a worn-out horse, 2 saddlebags of belongings, a sick child, and the particular kind of determination that has nothing left to be afraid of, because it has already lost everything it feared losing. He reached the gate at mid-morning. It was a real gate, solid timber, hinged properly, not the kind of lopsided thing you saw on spreads that were barely holding together. The fence line ran straight in both directions, farther than he could easily see. Whoever had built it knew what they were doing. Someone had cared about this place, and someone still cared about it, and Ethan could feel the difference between a ranch that was being survived and a ranch that was being kept. He dismounted carefully, holding Emma against his shoulder. She stirred, but didn't wake. He walked through the gate and up toward the house. The house itself was bigger than he expected. 2 stories, solid timber construction, a wide porch that ran the full length of the front, curtains in the windows, a kitchen garden along the south side with things actually growing in it. 2 dogs came out to meet him before he reached the porch steps, big working dogs that circled him and Emma without barking, which told him something about how they'd been raised. He stood at the foot of the porch steps. He shifted Emma in his arms and looked up at the door. For a moment, he just stood there. He was 32 years old, and he felt like a man of 60. He had sawdust in his hair from a stable job 3 days ago in a town whose name he'd already forgotten. His shirt had been mended so many times there was more patch than original cloth. His boots had a crack in the left sole that he'd stuffed with folded paper because he couldn't afford a cobbler. He thought about Clara. He thought about the promise he'd made her. Then he raised his fist and knocked. The footsteps inside were quick and unhesitating, not the cautious shuffle of someone startled by a knock, but the brisk stride of a woman who was already in the middle of doing something and had simply redirected herself toward the door. It opened. Margaret Hawthorne was not what he expected. He wasn't sure exactly what he had expected. Something colder, maybe. Something harder. A woman who had been made brittle by loss and shaped herself into something sharp so that the world couldn't cut her. He had met women like that and understood them and did not judge them. But the woman in the doorway was not brittle. She was 34 years old, though she looked younger than that in person, and older than that in her eyes, a combination that meant she had lived real things. She was tall for a woman, straight-backed with dark hair pulled simply away from her face, and work-worn hands that she didn't try to hide. She was wearing an apron over a plain calico dress, and she was looking at him the way someone looks when they're going to make a decision quickly and correctly. Her eyes moved from his face to Emma's face. They stayed on Emma. "When was the last time your daughter had a proper meal?" Her voice was direct. Not unkind, but not soft. Just honest, the voice of someone who had learned that honesty was more useful than cushioning. Ethan opened his mouth. He meant to say something reasonable. He meant to say he was here about work, that he'd heard there might be something available, that he didn't want anything he hadn't earned. But Margaret Hawthorne was looking at Emma with an expression that undid him. It wasn't pity. He had seen pity plenty and knew its shape. Pity looks down. What Margaret was doing was different. She was looking at Emma the way you look at something that matters, something real, something that requires a response from you, whether you plan to give one or not. "Day before yesterday," Ethan said. "Maybe. I gave her what I had." Margaret's jaw tightened slightly. Just once. Then she stepped back from the door. "Bring her inside." "Ma'am, I came to ask about work." "I know why you came." She was already moving back toward the kitchen. "Bring her inside and sit her down. Whatever you came to ask can wait until that child has eaten." Ethan carried Emma through the door. The house smelled like bread and coffee, and something else he couldn't immediately name, a clean, inhabited smell. The smell of a place that someone actually lived in and tended. He had forgotten what that smelled like. He settled Emma onto a chair at the kitchen table. She woke up when he set her down, blinking slowly, her eyes unfocused for a moment before they found him. "Papa? I'm right here. Where are we?" "We're inside," he said. "We're okay." She looked around the kitchen with the careful attention of a child who has learned not to get comfortable in new places too quickly. Then she looked at Margaret, who was already at the stove, moving with the efficient confidence of someone who had cooked for a household for years, and done it alone. "Who is that?" Emma asked quietly. "Her name is Mrs. Hawthorne," Ethan said. "She's letting us come inside." Emma considered this. Then she said with the blunt honesty of a tired 6-year-old, "She looks busy." Margaret, without turning around, "I am busy. That doesn't mean you can't eat." Emma blinked. Then she looked at Ethan with an expression that said she thought she might like this woman. Margaret set a glass of milk in front of Emma first. Then bread sliced thick with butter. Then she went back to the stove and began warming something from a pot that had clearly already been cooking. Emma wrapped both hands around the milk glass and drank. Ethan watched his daughter drink and felt something crack open in his chest, not painfully, but the way ice cracks in spring, a sound that means something is changing. "You looking for permanent work or just passing through?" Margaret said, still at the stove, her back to him. "Permanent if there is any," Ethan said. "I can do whatever needs doing. Fences, cattle building. I've worked ranches before. I had my own back in Kansas before." He stopped. "Before things changed." "Before the drought," Margaret said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, ma'am." "A lot of men came through here from Kansas in the last 3 years. Most of them looking for something for nothing. I'm not looking for something for nothing." She turned around then. She looked at him. Really looked the kind of assessment that takes in more than just the surface. His hands. His eyes. The way he was sitting, which was close to Emma, without hovering, the practiced positioning of a man who'd learned to keep his child near without making her feel watched. "I can see that," she said. She brought bowls of bean soup to the table and sat down across from Emma. Not across from him. A detail that registered with him because it was deliberate. She positioned herself where Emma could see her easily. "What's your name?" Margaret asked Emma. "Emma Walker." "How old are you, Emma Walker?" Emma held up 6 fingers, which was still her preferred method of answering that question, and Margaret's mouth did something that was almost a smile. "Do you know how to feed chickens?" Emma's eyes widened. "We don't have chickens." "I do," Margaret said. 17 of them. They're inconvenient and loud, and I'm fairly certain 3 of them are conspiring against me. But they lay good eggs. If you wanted to help with them while your father and I talk, I wouldn't object." Emma looked at Ethan. "Go ahead," he said. Margaret called her ranch hand an older man named Hector, who appeared at the back door with the quiet efficiency of someone long accustomed to being summoned, and asked him to show Emma the chicken yard. Hector took one look at Emma, nodded once, and extended a weathered hand that Emma took without hesitation. The back door closed. Ethan and Margaret were alone. "Tell me about Kansas," Margaret said. So he told her. He told her about the land, 300 acres, good soil, a creek that ran clean most years. He told her about the cattle he'd built up over 7 years of careful work, starting with 12 head and getting to over 60 before the drought hit. He told her about the failed harvest, and the second failed harvest, and the third that finished it. He told her about the bank, and the man with folded hands and polite pity. He did not tell her about Clara. Not yet. But she asked. "Emma's mother. 2 years ago," he said. "Fever." Margaret was quiet for a moment. "I'm sorry," she said. Not the automatic kind of sorry people say to fill silence. The real kind, weighted and specific, the sorry of someone who knows what that sentence actually means. "I know you lost your husband," Ethan said. He'd been told that much in town. And he stopped because he'd heard something else in town too. Something about a child, and he wasn't sure if he should say it. "My son," Margaret said. "James, he was 3 years old." Her voice was steady. She had clearly said this before, had learned to say it without breaking the way you learn to pick up something hot. By doing it so many times, you build calluses. "He and my husband died the same winter. Influenza." "I'm sorry," Ethan said. "The real kind." "That was 6 years ago," Margaret said. "I've run this ranch alone since then." She paused, and something in her expression shifted. Not softened exactly, but adjusted like a door opening, just a degree. "I have not asked anyone for help, and I have not needed anyone to offer it. I am not telling you that to be cold. I'm telling you so you understand what this ranch is to me." "I understand," Ethan said. "Do you?" "Yes, ma'am. It's the thing you kept, when everything else went." She looked at him for a long moment. "Yes," she said. "Exactly that." The silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people who have recognized something in each other and are deciding what to do with the recognition. "I need a fence man," Margaret said. "The north pasture fence is coming down in 3 places, and the cattle keep getting into the Bradbury property. I need someone who can handle the cattle drive to Billings in October. I need someone who can fix the barn roof before winter. I need—" She paused. "I need more than one man can do alone if I'm honest about it. I've been making do with Hector and one seasonal hand, but Hector's getting on in years, and he won't say so, and I won't say so to him, but the work is too much for the 2 of us." "I can do all of that," Ethan said, "and more. Your wage would be fair. $12 a month room and board. There's a bunkhouse. Hector has it to himself now, but it has 2 rooms. That's more than fair." "There's one condition," Margaret said. He waited. "Emma," she said. "She stays here at the house, with me. She doesn't sleep in the bunkhouse. She eats at this table." Ethan was quiet. "Mrs. Hawthorne, I'm not offering you charity," she said, and her voice had a firmness in it that he recognized, the firmness of someone saying something they've thought about carefully, not something they're making up as they go. "I'm offering your daughter a home, while you're working. She needs someone with her during the day. I'm here. That's practical. That's all it is." He looked at her. She was looking at the back door where Emma had gone out, and there was something in her expression that she probably didn't know was visible, a kind of hunger, quiet and controlled, the look of someone standing at a window watching something they thought they'd never have again. "That's not all it is," Ethan said quietly. Margaret's jaw tightened. Then, "No, I suppose it isn't." A long moment. "She reminds you of him," Ethan said. "Of James." Margaret set her hands flat on the table. "She reminds me," Margaret said carefully, "of what this house is supposed to sound like." Ethan looked at his hands. He thought about Clara. He thought about the promise. He thought about what Clara would have said if she could see this moment, a woman with warm bread and 17 inconvenient chickens and eyes that went soft when she looked at Emma offering his daughter something he had tried for 2 years to give her and hadn't been able to. Clara would have said, "Ethan, don't be a fool." "All right," he said. Margaret nodded once. "You can start on the north fence tomorrow morning," she said. "Hector will show you where it's worst." She stood and began clearing the table, and Ethan stood to help, and she started to wave him off and then didn't, and they worked side by side in the kitchen for a few minutes without talking. Outside, Emma's laugh drifted through the window. Ethan stopped moving. He hadn't heard Emma laugh in weeks. Genuinely laugh, the full, unguarded, belly-deep laugh that children produce when they forget to be careful. He'd forgotten what it sounded like. Margaret had gone still, too. They both listened to it standing in her kitchen, with their hands full of dishes, like 2 people who had heard something they'd stopped believing they'd ever hear again. "Told you they were conspiring," Margaret said, and her voice was quiet and strange, like she was testing what it felt like to make a joke, to offer something light into the air and see if it held. "Chickens are like that," Ethan said. She glanced at him, just briefly, and then she went back to the dishes. But something had shifted. He felt it, and he was fairly certain she felt it too, though neither of them would have been able to say exactly what it was. Just that the kitchen felt different than it had 10 minutes ago. Just that the house, which had been quiet and correct, and very slightly like a held breath, had exhaled. Emma came back inside an hour later with straw in her hair, and a story about a hen she had named Duchess, who had, Emma was absolutely certain, tried to sit on her foot on purpose. She told the story with her hands, the way she always did. Her eyes bright, her voice skipping ahead of her words, with the excitement of someone who has forgotten to be tired. Margaret listened to every word. She did not interrupt. She did not rush the story toward its point, or look anywhere else while Emma was talking. She just listened with her chin in her hand, leaning slightly toward the child at her table. And when Emma finished the story, Margaret said very seriously, "I believe you. Duchess has always had opinions." Emma stared at her. "You know which one is Duchess?" "I know all 17 of them," Margaret said. "Though I will admit that Duchess is the most difficult." Emma's expression was one of pure, uncomplicated delight, the look of a child who has discovered that an adult she was uncertain about might actually be remarkable. She looked at Ethan. He shrugged because he had nothing to offer on the subject of chickens. She looked back at Margaret. "Can I come back tomorrow?" "You live here now?" Margaret said simply. "So, yes." Emma absorbed this. "Okay," she said, like it was that simple. Because for her it was, children can accept new things with a speed and completeness that adults have spent years learning not to manage. That night, Ethan settled Emma into the small bedroom Margaret had opened up at the end of the hall. A room that was clean and simply furnished and smelled faintly of cedar, a room that had clearly been kept ready for something without anyone saying so out loud. Emma was asleep before her head fully reached the pillow. Ethan sat on the edge of the bed for a while, watching her breathe. He thought about everything he'd lost: the land, the cattle, the house in Kansas Clara. He thought about 2 years of barely and almost and not quite. He thought about Mrs. Pruitt's worried voice saying, "Emma cries at night, she calls for you," and how that had hit him in a place so deep he hadn't known the place existed. He had come to Hawthorne Ranch looking for a job. He had found something he didn't have a word for yet. He smoothed Emma's hair back from her forehead, the way Clara used to, the way he'd tried to replicate exactly because Emma seemed to like it, and he needed to keep giving her things that were familiar. "We're okay," he said very quietly. "I think we're going to be okay, B." Emma didn't wake up, but she turned her face slightly toward the sound of his voice the way she always did, even in sleep, finding him, orienting herself, settling. He stood up. He walked down the hall toward the back door. Margaret was on the porch, sitting in one of the 2 chairs there, looking out at the dark land under a sky full of stars. She had a cup of something hot in her hands. She didn't look up when he came out, but she didn't look away either. Ethan leaned against the porch rail and looked out at the same darkness. "Hector tells me the fence situation is worse than he let on," Margaret said. "I figured. The northwest corner is basically open range at this point. I've lost 3 head to the Bradbury side this month alone. I'll get to it first thing. There are tools in the barn. Hector will know where everything is." "All right." A pause. "She out?" Margaret asked. "Before I'd even closed the door," Ethan said. Margaret nodded. Another silence, the same kind as before, the kind that didn't require filling. "Mrs. Hawthorne," Ethan said. "Margaret," she said. "If you're going to work this ranch and your daughter is going to eat at my table, you can call me Margaret." "Margaret," he said. "I want to be clear about something." She glanced at him. "I came here for a job," he said. "I'm grateful for what you've offered. I mean to earn it. I mean to work this ranch the way it deserves to be worked, and I mean to make sure you never regret opening that door." She looked at him for a long moment. "I don't generally do things I expect to regret," she said. "No," he said. "I can see that." She looked away again, back at the dark land. "The fence," she said. "Northwest corner first." "Northwest corner first," he agreed. The stars were very bright above Montana territory that night. In the small bedroom at the end of the hall, Emma Walker slept without crying for the first time in months. And on the porch of Hawthorne Ranch, two people who had each lost the lives they thought they were going to have sat in the particular quiet of a summer night and didn't say anything else because they had said enough, and because sometimes what a person needs most is not more words, but simply the presence of someone else in the dark who knows what it means to have kept going anyway. The northwest fence would need 4 days of solid work. Ethan had already started planning it in his head. He didn't know yet what else he was building. The northwest fence took 4 days. Ethan had estimated that correctly, but what he hadn't estimated was Hector. Hector Reyes was 61 years old, built like a man who had spent 40 years arguing with the land and winning most of those arguments, and he had worked Hawthorne Ranch for 11 years without a single day he couldn't account for. He did not talk much. He did not ask questions. He didn't need answers to. He showed Ethan where the tools were, showed him where the fence was worst, and then stood back and watched with his arms crossed, while Ethan worked for about 20 minutes before saying anything. What he said was, "You're setting the post too shallow." Ethan stopped. "Ground's dry," Hector said. "Go soft 4 inches down. You go shallow first. Freeze comes, that post heaves right out. Done it right, you want 30 inches minimum." 30 inches, Ethan said. "Montana winters," Hector said, which he apparently considered a complete explanation because he uncrossed his arms and picked up a post digger and handed it over like the matter was settled. Ethan dug to 30 inches. They worked without talking for long stretches, which suited Ethan fine. He was not a man who needed noise to feel comfortable in another person's presence, and Hector seemed to operate on a similar principle. They communicated in the practical language of men doing physical work, a gesture toward the next post hole, a lifted chin at the wire that needed stretching, the occasional single word that stood in for a whole sentence. By the second day, Ethan understood that Hector had already made up his mind about him. He wasn't sure yet which direction that mind had gone. On the morning of the third day, they were working the section closest to the Bradbury property line, when Hector said, without looking up from what he was doing, "She doesn't let people in." Ethan kept working. "Margaret," Hector said, as if Ethan might have thought he meant someone else. "I noticed," Ethan said. "Not because she's cold." Hector straightened up and looked at the fence line. "People say she's cold. People are lazy. They see a woman who doesn't fall apart in front of them, and they call it cold because they don't have a better word." "I don't think she's cold," Ethan said. Hector glanced at him. "She lost her husband and her boy in the same winter," Hector said. "I was here. I watched her bury them both. I watched her walk back into that house and come out the next morning and tell me what needed doing. She didn't stop. She didn't break down where anybody could see. She just kept going." He paused. "Most people thought that was strange. I thought it was the bravest thing I'd ever seen." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "It is," he said. Hector looked at him for another second, then went back to the wire. "Emma's a good girl," he said. "She is. She asked me this morning if Duchess was always mean, or if something happened to make her that way." Ethan almost smiled. "What did you tell her?" "Told her some creatures are just born with opinions," Hector said. "She said that sounded like her papa." Ethan did smile then briefly, and despite himself. Hector made a sound that might have been a laugh if it had traveled a little further. They finished the northwest section by the end of the 4th day, and when Ethan reported to Margaret at the kitchen table that evening, she kept the ranch accounts there, a ledger open beside her coffee cup. She looked up from the ledger and said, "Hector says it's the best fence work he's seen in 10 years. "Hector set the standard," Ethan said. "I just followed it." Margaret looked at him with the expression he was starting to recognize, the slight narrowing of her eyes that meant she was deciding whether what he'd said was false modesty or actual honesty. "The cattle are back in the north pasture," she said. "All of them." "Yes, ma'am." Margaret. She made a small mark in her ledger. "The barn roof next, before the rains come if possible. I'll start tomorrow." She nodded already back to the ledger, and Ethan was halfway to the door when she said without looking up, "Emma read to me tonight. From the McGuffey reader. She's further along than I expected for her age." Ethan stopped. "Clara taught her," he said, "before she got sick. Emma picked it up fast." A pause. "She reads with expression," Margaret said. "She makes different voices for different characters." "She does," Ethan said. "Drives me half crazy when I'm trying to sleep and she's going at it." He heard something in the silence that followed a sound he couldn't quite categorize, brief and soft, that he realized after a half second was Margaret laughing. Not a big laugh, just a small one, private, like something that had escaped before she'd decided to let it go. She didn't say anything else. Ethan went out to the bunkhouse. He lay in the dark and stared at the ceiling and thought about the sound of it, that small escaping laugh, and felt something stir in him that he firmly told himself was just the particular relief of a man who had been worried about his daughter for 2 years and was watching slowly and cautiously the worry lift. That was all it was. He was fairly certain that was all it was. 2 weeks passed. The barn roof came together faster than he'd expected, because he discovered on the second day that Hector had strong opinions about roofing technique and was willing to demonstrate them, which meant that what might have been a one-man job of slow, careful progress became a two-man job of fast, careful progress. And by the end of the week, the barn roof was sound, and Margaret stood below it during an afternoon rainstorm with her arms crossed, looking up, watching it not leak with an expression of such evident satisfaction that Ethan felt something close to pride about it. "No drips," Hector observed. "Hector," Margaret said, "if you say 'told you so,' I will find a reason to have you fix every fence post in the south pasture." Hector said nothing, but the angle of his chin communicated "told you so" clearly enough. Emma had made herself at home. There was no other way to describe it. She had arrived at Hawthorne Ranch with the instinctive sociability of a child who had been moving too long and recognized somewhere below conscious thought that this place was different. Within the first week, she knew where everything in the kitchen was kept. She knew Hector's coffee preferences and had taken it upon herself to bring it to him in the morning in a specific way, black in the blue cup, not the gray one, and Hector had accepted this service with the solemn dignity of a man receiving something significant. She had named 11 of the 17 chickens. She had opinions about all 17. But what Ethan watched most carefully with the specific attention of a parent who is hoping for something and is afraid of hoping too much was what happened between Emma and Margaret. It did not happen all at once. Margaret was not the kind of woman who rushed anything. She was careful with Emma, the way she was careful with everything that mattered to her, deliberately precisely without sentimentality, but with a consistency that Emma felt and responded to the way children respond to consistency, by relaxing into it, by trusting it, by beginning to expect it. She taught Emma to make biscuits. This happened on the 9th day, when a rainstorm kept them both inside and Emma had exhausted the McGuffey reader and was by her own report bored enough to consider talking to Duchess, which she described as a last resort. Margaret, without particular ceremony, cleared a section of the kitchen table and said, "Come here. I'll show you something more useful than talking to a hen." Emma came. Margaret showed her how to measure flour, how to cut in the lard until it looked right, how much buttermilk and why buttermilk and not regular milk, and what the difference felt like in your hands. She talked through all of it practical and clear, without the particular kind of performed enthusiasm some adults use around children, just the actual information delivered like it mattered because it did matter, and Emma listened to all of it with the focused attention she gave to things she decided were worth learning. The biscuits came out uneven but good. Ethan had come in from the barn during the rain and stood in the kitchen doorway watching Emma present a biscuit to him, with both hands, her face full of the particular pride of someone who has made a thing that is real and edible. "I made that," Emma announced. "I can see that," Ethan said. "Margaret showed me how." He looked over Emma's head at Margaret, who was at the stove with her back to them, but who had gone just slightly still at the sound of Emma using her first name, not correcting it, just registering it and then letting it stand. "It's excellent," Ethan said and took a bite, and it was. Emma turned and went to tell Hector. Ethan looked at Margaret's back. "Thank you," he said quietly. She turned around then, and she was carrying a coffee pot, and her expression was its usual composed self, but there was something around her eyes that was different. "For what? You know for what?" She poured coffee into 2 cups and set one on the table near him, then went back to what she'd been doing. "She's easy to teach," Margaret said. "She pays attention. Her mother was the same way." A pause. "Tell me about her," Margaret said. "Clara." He hadn't expected that. He sat down at the table and he told her. He told her about how Clara had grown up in Tennessee and come west with her family at 17 and been the most pragmatic person he'd ever met, not unfeeling, but clear-eyed, the kind of woman who looked at a problem and saw the path through it instead of the difficulty of the path. He told her about how Clara had loved the Kansas land with a specificity he'd never quite matched. She could tell you which soil was good for what, and which section of the creek ran sweetest, and which part of the property caught the best light in October. And she had loved all of it, not in spite of its hardness, but including it the whole complicated fact of it. He told her about the last 3 days of the fever, and he told her about the promise, and he stopped there, because that was as far as the words could take him. Margaret was quiet. "The promise," she said. "Is that why you're still going? That's part of it. What's the other part?" He looked at his coffee cup. "Emma herself," he said. She keeps being interested in things. She keeps finding things to be curious about. Even when we had nothing and were going nowhere, she'd ask me questions about the stars, about how rivers work, about why horses get spooked, and what they're afraid of. She just keeps being interested." He paused. "It's hard to give up on someone who hasn't given up." Margaret was quiet for a long time after that. Then, "James was like that too, before the influenza." Her voice was steady. "He had decided at 3 years old that he was going to understand how everything worked. He would take things apart. Buttons hinges the latch on the grain bin. His father came out one morning, and the entire grain bin was open because James had figured out the latch." The almost smile again. His father was furious and proud at the same time and couldn't decide which to be, so he just stood there. Ethan looked at her. "What was his name?" Ethan asked. "Your husband." "Robert," she said. "Robert Hawthorne. Good man." "The best I knew," she said simply. "Not perfect, stubborn past the point of reason sometimes, but the kind of man who, when something needed doing, did it without talking about it first. That's rarer than people think." "It is," Ethan agreed. They sat at the kitchen table, in the sound of the rain, and drank their coffee and talked about the people they'd lost with the specific ease of 2 people who had each discovered that the other understood the weight of the thing. Not the general weight of grief, which everyone knows about, but the specific weight of a particular person's absence, the way a room can be entirely furnished and still feel empty because one specific person is no longer in it. It was the longest conversation Ethan had had with another adult in 2 years. He thought about that on the walk to the bunkhouse that night in the rain, and he felt the strangeness of it, that talking about Clara to this woman had not made him sadder, but had made him feel in some quiet and unexpected way less alone in it. He told himself to be careful. He told himself this with conviction, and with the awareness that telling yourself to be careful is generally most necessary when you already know you're not being careful enough. The trouble started on a Thursday, 5 weeks after Ethan arrived at Hawthorne Ranch. He had ridden into Milford, the nearest town 7 miles east, to collect supplies Margaret had ordered. It was a straightforward errand. He had done it twice before without incident, and the townspeople had treated him with the distant civil courtesy that frontier towns generally extended to strangers they hadn't made up their minds about yet. This time was different. He was at the general store loading sacks into the wagon when he heard it. 2 men talking on the boardwalk nearby. They weren't being particularly quiet about it, which Ethan understood was the point. "Heard she's let some drifter move himself right in out at the Hawthorne place," the first man said. "That right?" said the second. It was not a question. "Shows up with some sob story and a sick kid, and she falls for it, hook and line." Margaret Hawthorne always did have a soft spot she didn't like to admit. If she's got the sense God gave a fence post, she'll run him off before winter. Ethan kept loading the wagon. He kept his face toward the wagon and his hands on the work, and he breathed slowly and evenly, and he did not turn around. He had heard worse. He had learned in 2 years of moving from place to place with a child on his hip that most cruelty of this kind was not personal. It was just the sound of small people, in small places, making themselves feel large by making someone else feel small. It was not worth answering. It was not worth his attention. He finished loading the wagon paid at the counter and was climbing up to drive out when a voice said from the boardwalk, "You the man out at the Hawthorne place?" Ethan looked. The man who'd spoken was standing in front of the feed store across the street. He was perhaps 50 heavy across the shoulders, with the particular bearing of a man who expected his questions to be answered quickly. He wore a good suit for a Thursday morning in a small Montana town, which told Ethan something. A man in a good suit on a weekday in a town like Milford was either the banker, the judge, or someone who wanted people to think he was one of those things. "That's right," Ethan said. "Charles Whitmore," the man said. He didn't offer a handshake. He said his name the way people say the name of something they expect you to already know. "Ethan Walker." "Mr. Walker." Whitmore walked to the edge of the boardwalk, not down to the street level, staying elevated. "I'll be direct with you. I've had an interest in the Hawthorne property for some time. Land that size managed by a woman alone has a way of becoming complicated over time." Ethan looked at him steadily. "Seems like she's managed it well," Ethan said. "She's managed it adequately," Whitmore said. "But adequately isn't the same as well, and anyone paying attention can see the difference. I've made Margaret fair offers before. She hasn't been receptive." He paused, studying Ethan with an appraiser's eye. "I just want to make sure that when the time comes, and it will come, these things have a way of resolving that the people involved understand where the sensible interests lie." "I'm hired help," Ethan said. "Ranch business isn't mine to comment on." "Of course not," Whitmore said pleasantly. He stepped back from the edge of the boardwalk. "Just thought it worthwhile to make your acquaintance. Small county Mr. Walker. People in small counties have long memories." He went back into the feed store. Ethan drove the wagon back to Hawthorne Ranch without pushing the horses, which was what he wanted to do, because he had learned that the urge to move fast when something has unsettled you is usually the wrong impulse, and you end up somewhere before you've thought through what you're going to say when you get there. He thought about what he was going to say. He told Margaret that evening. He found her in the barn, checking on a cow that had been off her feed, and he stood in the barn doorway and told her about Whitmore accurately, and without editorializing just what the man had said and how he'd said it. Margaret listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "How long has he been after the land?" Ethan asked. 4 years, she said. She moved away from the cow and brushed her hands on her skirt. He started making offers the year after Robert died. First they were reasonable, then they were less reasonable. Then he started going to the county clerk's office and asking questions about the title records, which is when I hired a lawyer in Billings to make sure everything was in order. She paused. "Everything is in order." "But he's still asking." "He's still asking," she confirmed. "Charles Whitmore has made a great deal of money by deciding he wants something and then waiting until the person who has it becomes too tired or too troubled to keep fighting." She looked at Ethan directly. "He usually picks people who are fighting alone." "You've been fighting alone." "Yes." A pause, and something shifted in her expression. Not uncertainty exactly, but a kind of frank acknowledgement that she hadn't allowed herself before. "Until recently." Ethan was quiet. "He's going to make trouble," Ethan said. "He's been making trouble," Margaret said. "Now he's making it with better information. He knows you're here. He'll try to use that." "How?" She was quiet for a moment. "People in Milford are already talking," she said. "I know because Sarah Croft at the dry goods store looks at me differently when I come in, and Sarah Croft is the town telegraph. Whatever she knows, everyone knows within 48 hours. They're talking about a widow and a strange man, and what that means, and Whitmore will take whatever they're saying and make it worse because that's how he operates." "I can leave," Ethan said. "If my being here is what's causing the problem, No, Margaret said. Flat, immediate, no hesitation. No, she said again, and her voice had something in it that wasn't quite anger, but was related to it. The particular heat of a woman who has been managing other people's opinions of her for 6 years and has reached the end of her willingness to let those opinions cost her anything. Emma is settled, she said. You are doing work this ranch needs. I am not rearranging my life because Charles Whitmore and a handful of people with nothing better to think about have decided to make it their business. She looked at him. Are you? No, ma'am, he said. Then it's settled. She walked past him out of the barn, and he turned and watched her go. And there was something in the set of her shoulders, straight decided absolutely, unafraid, that hit him somewhere below the sternum. He had known women who were strong. Clara had been strong. But Clara's strength had been quiet, warm, a deep well kind of strength. Margaret's strength was different. It was structural, like load-bearing timber, like the kind of thing that holds up under pressure because it was built to. He admitted to himself in the barn doorway, extremely in trouble. He went in to help with supper. The following Sunday, they went to church in Milford. This had been Margaret's idea, and Ethan had understood why before she explained it. Running from the town's opinion was worse than facing it directly. Absence let rumors fill the space. Presence forced people to deal with the actual reality of a thing instead of the version they'd invented. They went in together. Margaret, Ethan, and Emma, and sat in the third pew from the front, because that was where Margaret always sat, and she was not going to change that either. Ethan was aware of the looks. He was practiced enough at being looked at to catalog them without reacting. There was the curious look, which was just information gathering. The disapproving look, which came from 2 older women in the second pew who had clearly already decided what they thought. There was the look from a man across the aisle that was specifically directed at Ethan and communicated a kind of territorial assessment, sizing him up the way men do when they're not sure if someone is a threat or can be dismissed. And there was Whitmore in the front pew, who did not look at them at all, which was its own kind of statement. Emma sat between Margaret and Ethan and paid earnest attention to the sermon, which was about stewardship, and whispered one question during the quietest part of the service. The question audible to the 4 nearest pews was, "Does God know about chickens?" Ethan fixed his eyes on the minister and did not move his face. Margaret beside Emma put a hand over her mouth. Her shoulders moved once. The minister, to his credit, did not lose his place. After the service on the steps outside, 2 things happened in quick succession. The first was that the town doctor, a man named Aldrich, who looked like he'd been practicing medicine since before Montana was a territory, came over and shook Ethan's hand, and asked after Emma's health, and said he'd heard the Hawthorne fence work was the best in the county. The second was that Charles Whitmore appeared at Margaret's elbow. "Margaret," he said, "you're looking well." "Charles," she said. Her voice was the voice she used when she was being precise about everything. "I was hoping we might have a moment," Whitmore said, glancing at Ethan, in a way that was designed to suggest Ethan should remove himself. Ethan did not remove himself. "Mr. Walker works for me," Margaret said. "You can speak in front of him." Whitmore's smile did not change, but something behind it did. "I've been thinking about our conversations regarding the property," he said. "I wanted to revisit the offer I made in January. In light of changing circumstances, I think we might find terms that work better for everyone." "The terms I found acceptable in January," Margaret said, "are the same terms I find acceptable now, which is to say I am not interested in selling." "Margaret, I understand there's sentiment attached." "It's not sentiment," she said. "It's my ranch, my deed, my cattle, my life's work." She said each word like she was placing something solid on a table, one at a time. "I'm not selling it because I'm not selling it. That's the whole of the explanation." Whitmore looked at Ethan. "I wonder," Whitmore said pleasantly, "if Mr. Walker here has given you a full accounting of himself, where he comes from, what he left behind. A man shows up with nothing but a story and a child and somehow ends up, Mr. Whitmore?" Ethan's voice was quiet, just quiet. "You've made your position clear to Mrs. Hawthorne. She's given you her answer. There's nothing else to talk about today. A pause. Whitmore's eyes moved between them. As I said, Whitmore said finally. Small county. Long memories. He walked away. Margaret exhaled just once, just slightly, the single breath of a person who has been holding steady under pressure. Thank you, she said. I didn't do anything, Ethan said. You stayed where you were, she said. That was enough. Emma appeared between them and tugged Margaret's sleeve. Can we go? I want to check if Duchess laid anything this morning. Yes, Margaret said, and her voice had come all the way back to itself. We can go. They drove back to Hawthorne Ranch in the Sunday quiet, Emma in the middle of the wagon seat between them, telling a detailed story about which chickens she thought were friends with each other and which ones she suspected had unresolved conflicts. Ethan listened to Emma and felt the road under the wheels and was aware with a clarity he couldn't quite argue himself out of that. This specific thing, this particular arrangement of people in a wagon on a Sunday morning, felt more like home than anything had felt in 2 years, which was exactly what made the thing that happened 3 days later so devastating. It was Wednesday morning, just after first light, when the sheriff rode onto Hawthorne Ranch. He was not alone. He had a deputy with him, and he had the particular expression of a man who doesn't enjoy his job, but is going to do it anyway. He found Ethan at the barn, and he said the words without ceremony because there is no good way to say them. Ethan Walker, I have a complaint filed against you for the theft of cattle from the Henderson property. 3 head taken sometime in the last 2 weeks. He paused. I'm going to need you to come with me. Ethan stood very still. I have not been near the Henderson property, he said. That may be, the sheriff said, but there's a witness says otherwise. What witness? The sheriff looked uncomfortable. Man named Dillard, works for Charles Whitmore. The air between them was very quiet. I see, Ethan said. He looked at the barn. He looked at the house. He thought about Emma, inside probably already awake, probably already looking for Margaret to ask about the chickens. He thought about Margaret. He thought about what this was going to cost her. The talk, the questions, the ammunition it handed to Whitmore and everyone else who'd been looking for a reason to say she'd made a mistake. He thought about the promise he'd made on her porch on the first night. I mean, to make sure you never regret opening that door. The sheriff was watching him. All right, Ethan said. Let me tell Mrs. Hawthorne. Margaret was already on the porch when he turned around. She had heard. She had come out in time to hear most of it. She was standing straight, both hands at her sides, her face completely still. He walked up to the porch. It's not true, he said, first, before anything else, because that was the first thing she needed to know. I know, she said, immediately, no hesitation. That hit him hard, harder than the accusation, harder than the presence of the sheriff behind him, the speed and completeness of her certainty. Whitmore, he said. I know, she said again. I'll go with the sheriff. I'll answer the questions. It'll be straightened out. He watched her jaw tighten. Ethan, she said, and it was the first time she'd used his first name, and he registered it, stored it even in the middle of all of this. I'll be all right, he said. I'm not worried about you being all right, she said, and there was something fierce in her voice now, not fear, something harder and hotter than fear. I'm worried about what happens to Emma if you're not here. He looked at her. Keep her close, he said. Don't let her think anything is wrong. She'll know something is wrong. Then tell her I had to go into town and I'll be back. Because I will be back. Margaret looked at him for a long moment. I know, she said the third time, and each time she said it, she meant it more and in more directions. The sheriff's deputy shifted his weight behind Ethan. Ethan held Margaret's gaze for one more second. Then he put on his hat, stepped off the porch, and walked toward the sheriff's horse with the straight back and unhurried stride of a man who has done nothing wrong and intends to prove it, because there is no other acceptable option, because everything he cares about is standing on that porch watching him go, and he is not. He has never been a man who walks away from things he cares about. But the road to Milford was long, and Charles Whitmore had been planning this for longer than 1 week. The road to Milford was 7 miles of hard-packed dirt, and Ethan walked most of it in his head, before the horses had covered half of it. He was not afraid. That was the strange thing he had expected fear and found instead a cold, focused clarity, the particular mental state that arrives when a situation has become so serious that the mind stops spinning and starts working. He ran the facts the way a man runs his hands over a fence line, looking for the break methodically, without panic, because panic fixes nothing, and he had too much to protect to afford it. He had not been near the Henderson property. He knew his own movements for the past 2 weeks, the way he knew the contours of the ranch work precisely because precise men don't lose track of where they've been and what they've done. He had been on Hawthorne land every day. He had witnesses. He had Hector, who was not a man given to exaggeration or loyalty, that outran the truth, and whose word in this county meant something because he had been here for 11 years and his word had never been questioned. What he didn't have was certainty about what Whitmore had built. A man like Whitmore didn't move impulsively. He had planned this, which meant the accusation was layered, not just a witness claim that could be simply contradicted, but something that had been constructed to be difficult to dismantle quickly. The question was what the construction looked like and where the weak points were. Ethan thought about Margaret's face on the porch. The immediacy of her "I know," not a question, not a hesitation. He held on to that. The sheriff's name was Ben Calloway, and Ethan had formed a cautious estimate of him on the ride into town, a man who was honest enough to be uncomfortable doing something he suspected was being used for someone else's purposes, but not quite independently minded enough to refuse. That was a specific kind of problem, and also a specific kind of opportunity. An uncomfortable, honest man could be reasoned with. An uncomfortable, honest man had enough conscience left to be useful if the right information reached him in the right order. Sheriff Calloway. Ethan said about a mile outside of Milford. "Mr. Walker." "This witness Dillard. You know him well." A pause. "Well enough," Calloway said. "Worked for Whitmore long." "About 8 months, I'd say." "Anyone in the county can speak to his character independent of Whitmore." Calloway was quiet for several seconds. "That's something a lawyer would ask," he said. "It's something any man falsely accused would ask." Ethan said, "I'm not looking to cause difficulty, Sheriff. I'm looking to go home to my daughter. The faster the truth comes out, the better for everyone." Calloway looked at him sidelong. "You're a calm man for someone in your situation." "Being upset won't change the facts," Ethan said. "And the facts are on my side." Another silence. "Dillard says he saw you on the Henderson property line 2 Saturdays ago," Calloway said. "Says he saw you moving cattle east." 2 Saturdays ago," Ethan said immediately. "I was rebuilding the corner section of the north pasture fence with Hector Reyes from first light until past midday. Then I was at the Hawthorne barn replacing 3 sections of rotten roofing timber. Mrs. Hawthorne brought water out at mid-morning. She can account for every hour." Calloway said nothing. "Hector can account for every hour," Ethan continued. "The timber I replaced is still there. The fence posts are in the ground. There is nothing, not one piece of anything that puts me on Henderson's property because I have never been on Henderson's property." Calloway pulled up slightly on the reins without fully stopping. "I believe you may be telling the truth," he said. "I am telling the truth." "That doesn't mean this goes away fast," Calloway said. "A complaint's been filed. I have to hold you and conduct an inquiry. That's the law." "How long?" 24 hours minimum. More if the inquiry requires it." Ethan was quiet. "My daughter," he said. "She's 6. She's been through a great deal. She's at the Hawthorne place." "Yes?" Calloway looked at the road ahead. "Mrs. Hawthorne will look after her," he said. And it wasn't entirely a comfortable thing. He said it there was a note in his voice that suggested he knew exactly what this situation was and what it wasn't and was not entirely proud of his role in it. "She will," Ethan said. "That doesn't make it acceptable." They rode the rest of the way into Milford without speaking. The town jail was a single-room structure behind the sheriff's office, and it had 2 cells, both empty, when Ethan arrived. Calloway locked him into the first one with an expression of a man performing a duty he found distasteful. left a canteen of water on the bench without being asked, and said he would begin the inquiry the following morning. Then he left. Ethan sat in the cell. He had been in worse places. He had slept in barns in winter and worked for men who treated hired hands as slightly better than equipment and eaten meals that didn't deserve the name. A clean cell with a water canteen was not the worst situation he'd been in. But Emma didn't know where he was. That was what sat on his chest like a stone. Emma would be with Margaret. He knew that, trusted that, but Emma had lost one parent, and she had spent 2 years watching her father be the only fixed point in a moving world. And however well Margaret handled it, however calm and steady she managed to be, Emma would feel his absence as something wrong, as a gap, as the particular fear that children carry when the world has already proved to them that people they love can simply not be there anymore. He put his back against the cell wall and stared at the ceiling and thought about what Margaret would say to her. He found after a moment that he could hear it. Margaret's voice, direct and specific, not softening the situation into something false, but giving Emma something true to hold on to. "He'll be back, Emma." Because Ethan Walker is not the kind of man who doesn't come back. He didn't know if Margaret would say that, but he thought she might. Back at Hawthorne Ranch, the morning was not going the way Margaret intended. Emma had known something was wrong before Margaret said a word. She had come downstairs to find Margaret alone in the kitchen and Ethan not at the barn, and she had stood in the kitchen doorway and said with the flat precision of a child who has learned to read situations quickly, "Where's Papa?" Margaret sat down at the table and looked at Emma directly and told her the truth, because Emma Walker was not a child who could be managed with partial truths, and Margaret had understood that about her inside the first week. "He's in Milford," Margaret said. "Someone made a false accusation about him, and the sheriff had to look into it. He'll be back when the inquiry is done and the truth comes out." Emma's face went through several things very quickly. "Someone lied about my papa." "Yes." "Who?" "A man who wants something he can't have," Margaret said. "So he's trying to make trouble." "What does he want?" "This ranch," Margaret said. "He's wanted it for years. He thinks if he can get your father out of the way, things will be easier for him." Emma absorbed this. "He didn't count on my papa's record," Emma said. Margaret looked at her. "His record," Emma said with the specific confidence of someone quoting something they've been told. "Papa says an honest man's record is his armor. He says every day you do what's right, you're building something nobody can take away." Margaret was quiet for a moment. "Your father is a wise man," she said. "He's been working on this ranch every single day," Emma said. "He didn't steal anything. He wouldn't. He won't even take an extra biscuit without asking." She paused. "Sometimes it's irritating, actually. There were definitely extra biscuits." Something cracked open in Margaret's chest. She reached across the table and took Emma's hand. It was not something she'd done before. She was careful about touch. Careful about the particular intimacy of it, because she had learned that intimacy requires trust, and trust requires time, and she had learned that lesson at a cost she was still paying. But Emma's hand in hers felt like the most natural thing she had done in years. "He will be back by tomorrow," Margaret said. "I'm going to make sure of it." Emma looked at her. "How?" "Because," Margaret said, and her voice was the load-bearing timber voice, the voice that didn't bend. "I have spent 6 years making sure people who tried to take things from me understood that was a mistake. I am not going to stop now." She stood up. She went to her desk in the sitting room and she opened the bottom drawer and she took out a ledger that was not the ranch accounts. Ledger, a smaller one, leather-bound, which she carried to the kitchen table and opened to a page near the middle. She began to write. Hector appeared in the kitchen doorway at 8:30. "Heard what happened," he said. "News travels fast." Margaret said, not looking up. "Rufus at the livery saw them ride by," Hector said. "He came out to tell me." A pause. "What do you need?" "I need you to ride to the Henderson property and speak with Frank Henderson directly," Margaret said. "Not his foreman, not his hands, Frank himself. Ask him to account personally for what cattle he believes are missing and when he believes he first noticed. Ask him if he filed the complaint himself, or if someone brought the complaint to him. Hector was quiet for a moment. You think he didn't file it himself? I think, Margaret said carefully, that Frank Henderson is a decent man who can be made to feel like a thing has been done to him when it hasn't. I think someone showed him what looked like a problem and told him he'd been wronged before he had a chance to count his own cattle. Hector put on his hat. I'll be back by noon, he said. Take the black horse, she said. He's faster. Hector was already gone. Emma sat at the table watching Margaret. What's the ledger? Emma asked. Records, Margaret said. Every day your father has been on this ranch, I've noted what work was done and by whom. It's how I run this operation. I've done it since the first year I was alone here, because a woman running a cattle operation in Montana learns quickly that undocumented facts are no facts at all. So you can prove where Papa was. I can prove exactly where your father was every day for the past 5 weeks, Margaret said, down to the hour. Emma looked at the ledger. Then she looked at Margaret. You did that on purpose, Emma said slowly. Before any of this happened. You just kept track. I keep track of everything, Margaret said. It's not dramatic. It's just how you survive when you're doing it alone. Emma was quiet for a moment. Papa said you were the kind of person who thought ahead of things, she said. When did he say that? Last week. When I asked him why you always fix things before they broke instead of after. Emma paused. He said it's rarer than people think. Margaret kept writing. But her hand slowed just slightly for just a moment. In Milford, Ethan heard the door of the sheriff's office open at 10:30. He heard voices Calloway's, and another he didn't recognize at first and then did. Hector. Hector's voice flat and definitive, saying things Ethan couldn't fully make out through the wall. Then Calloway's voice asking something. Then Hector again, longer, more detailed. Then quiet. Then the sound of the outer door opening and closing again and footsteps, and Sheriff Calloway appeared in the doorway of the jail room with a piece of paper in his hand and an expression that was complicated in the way expressions get when a man is discovering he was used. Mr. Walker, he said. Ethan stood. I've just spoken with Hector Reyes, Calloway said. He's brought me Mrs. Hawthorne's work records for the past 5 weeks, a detailed written account of your whereabouts on the specific Saturday in question, and a signed statement from himself attesting that you were on Hawthorne property from before sunrise until well past dark on that day. That's accurate, Ethan said. I've also, Calloway said more slowly now, just received word that Frank Henderson has clarified his position on the complaint. He paused. Henderson says he didn't file a complaint. He says he was approached by a man who works for Charles Whitmore, who told Henderson that 3 of his cattle had been rustled and that he'd seen who'd done it. Henderson says he never counted his cattle and never verified any loss. He says he was told the paperwork was routine. Ethan looked at him. Henderson didn't even know his name was on a complaint, Calloway said. He didn't authorize it. Then there's no complaint, Ethan said. That's the legal conclusion, yes. Calloway looked at the paper in his hand with the expression of a man doing an accounting he doesn't enjoy. The complaint was filed on a false premise by someone without standing to file it. It doesn't hold. He looked up. You're free to go, Mr. Walker. He opened the cell. Ethan walked out. He retrieved his hat from the hook by the door, and he stood in the sheriff's office for a moment before saying what he was going to say, because he wanted to say it right. Sheriff, he said. Calloway looked at him. Whitmore used you, Ethan said. I don't think that sits well with you. I don't think it should. What he did using your office, your badge, your process to come after a decent woman's ranch and a man who's done nothing wrong. That's a kind of corruption that doesn't announce itself. It looks like procedure right up until you look at it clearly. Calloway was quiet. I'm aware of that, Mr. Walker, he said. I know you are, Ethan said. I just wanted to say it out loud. He walked out of the sheriff's office into the Milford street. He stood for a moment in the mid-morning heat. He thought about going to find Whitmore. He examined that impulse carefully, The way you examine something that looks like a good idea to determine whether it actually is one. And he concluded that walking into Charles Whitmore's world, angry and alone, was exactly what Whitmore would want. Because men like Whitmore were most comfortable in confrontations they had arranged on ground they had prepared in situations where the other man's emotion was their advantage. So he didn't go find Whitmore. He got his horse from the livery, paid what was owed, and rode back toward Hawthorne Ranch. The 7 miles back took 20 minutes, which meant he pushed Belle harder than he usually did, and he justified this to himself by noting that he had a 6-year-old daughter who didn't know he was free and who had spent the night without him, and he thought that was sufficient justification. He came up the ranch road, and Margaret was on the porch. She had seen him coming. She had probably heard the hoofbeats while he was still a quarter mile out, because Margaret Hawthorne was a woman who heard what was coming before it arrived. She was standing at the top of the porch steps with her arms at her sides, and she was watching him come, and when he pulled up and dismounted, she said nothing for a moment, just looked at him. Then, "Emma's in the kitchen." "Is she all right?" "She's been informed that you're honest, and that honest men's records are their armor," Margaret said. She held up well. She was worried. "I know. Hector is at the Henderson property verifying the cattle count personally." "Hector came to the jail?" Ethan said. "Brought your ledger records. It resolved the complaint." Something in Margaret's expression changed. A small controlled shift relief that she had been holding tightly enough that when she released it, it didn't show as relief, but as the particular exhale of someone who has been right about something difficult and is not going to make a performance of it. "Good," she said. Ethan tied Belle to the post. "The complaint was filed without Henderson's knowledge," Ethan said. "Whitmore's man put Henderson's name on it without Henderson authorizing it." Margaret's eyes narrowed. "That's fraud," she said. "It is." "Against the sheriff's office?" "Yes." A silence. "He went too far," Margaret said. Not with satisfaction, but with the specific assessment of a woman who has been watching a man's moves for 4 years and has just identified the error in his strategy. "He did," Ethan agreed. "He didn't account for your records. He thought he had enough to hold me 24 hours and use that time to apply pressure to you. And he didn't think through what you already had documented. He made the mistake most people make," Margaret said. "He assumed that because I'm a woman alone, I must be managing loosely." "He won't make that mistake twice," Ethan said. "He won't get the opportunity," Margaret said, and her voice had the quality of a door being closed. Final and complete. The back door burst open. Emma came across the yard at a run, which was her preferred method of movement when she had feelings that were too large for walking, and she hit Ethan at approximately the speed of a small freight train and wrapped her arms around his middle and said into his shirt something that sounded like it might have been "You came back," which was both obvious and not obvious at all. Ethan held her. He held her the way he'd been holding her since she was born, like she was the most specific thing in the world, the one exact thing that nothing else was equivalent to. "I'm back," he said. "I told you." "You didn't tell me anything," Emma said, muffled. "You just left." "I told Margaret to tell you I'd be back." Emma pulled back slightly and looked up at him. "She told me," Emma said. "She also told me the man who did it wanted the ranch and that you were going to be fine because honest men's records are their armor." She paused. "She also told me you never took an extra biscuit without asking which she said demonstrated consistent integrity." Ethan looked over Emma's head at Margaret. Margaret's expression was composed and serious. "I stand by all of those statements," she said. Ethan almost laughed, almost because his throat was tight in a way that wasn't quite laughter and wasn't quite the other thing, but was somewhere in the difficult country between them. "Come inside," Margaret said. "You haven't eaten." He hadn't. He'd forgotten, which told him something about where his mind had been. They went inside, and Emma sat beside him at the table and talked without stopping for approximately 15 minutes, covering the following subjects. What Hector had said when he heard about the arrest, which Emma characterized as colorful. What Duchess had done that morning, which involved the water trough and Margaret's good boots. And what Emma had decided about the man who had filed the false complaint, which was that he was going to find out that messing with the Hawthorne Ranch was a mistake. "That's a very serious position," Ethan said. "I'm a very serious person," Emma said. "You named a chicken Duchess." "Duchess is a serious chicken." Margaret set a plate in front of Ethan without comment, but the corner of her mouth was doing the thing it did. Ethan ate. He sat at the kitchen table with Emma beside him and Margaret across the room, and he ate the food she'd made and listened to his daughter talk and felt the particular texture of a moment he knew he would remember. Not because anything dramatic was happening in it, but because of its specific quality of rightness, the way something fits into a space it was meant for. He was also thinking about Whitmore. He was thinking about the fact that the false complaint had failed, which meant Whitmore was now in a different position than he'd intended to occupy, and men like Whitmore in uncomfortable positions did not sit with their discomfort. They moved to the next lever, and the question was, what lever remained to them? He found out 2 days later. It came in the form of a letter delivered to the ranch by the postal rider on a Friday afternoon. The letter was addressed to Margaret, and its return address was a law office in Helena. Margaret opened it at the kitchen table, read it once, and set it down on the table with a careful flatness that told Ethan more than any expression would have. He looked at her. "Read it," she said. He picked it up. The letter was from an attorney named Percival Greer, operating on behalf of a client it did not name. It stated that it had come to the attention of the client that certain tax assessments on the Hawthorne Ranch property had been improperly filed in the county records for the years 1884 and 1885, resulting in an underpayment of property taxes. It stated that the total sum owed, including applicable penalties and interest as calculated under Montana territorial law, came to $412, and that failure to remit this sum within 30 days would result in proceedings to place the property in tax lien status. Ethan read it twice. "Is it true?" he asked. "The tax assessments." "I don't know," Margaret said, and her voice was controlled in a way that suggested she was working very hard to keep it that way. "I have paid every tax bill I have ever received, every one, on time. But if records were altered at the county clerk's office..." She stopped. "The county clerk," Ethan said, "is a man named Gerald Poole," Margaret said, "who has for at least 3 years been seen having supper with Charles Whitmore every Thursday at the hotel restaurant in Milford." The kitchen was very quiet. "He altered the records," Ethan said, "retroactively, made it look like previous payments were deficient, or created assessments that were never actually sent to me and are now overdue," Margaret said. "Either way, the result is the same. I owe money I did not know I owed, and if I cannot produce it, I lose my land." "You have the money." She was quiet. "I have some of it," she said. "Not all of it, not at once. The cattle drive to Billings in October was supposed to be this year's operating revenue. That's 6 weeks away." $412 in 30 days, Ethan said. "Yes." He set the letter down. His mind was moving fast, now fast and clean, the way his mind moved when the situation had become specific enough that thinking broadly was no longer useful, and what was needed was a precise response to a precise problem. "Margaret," he said. She looked at him. "I have money," he said. "Not $400, but I have been paid wages for 5 weeks, and I've spent almost nothing. I have $83 in the bunkhouse." "Ethan, it's not enough," he said quickly. "I know that, but it's a start. And I need you to let me help, because that is not something I am willing to debate." Her jaw tightened. "I'm not taking your wages," she said. "You're not taking them. I'm choosing to use them in a way that benefits this ranch. This ranch that Emma eats at. This ranch that I work. That's my choice to make." She looked at him. He held her gaze. "There's also the Billings lawyer," he said. "The one you hired for the title work. We need to contact him today. If the county records were falsified, that's a criminal matter. If we can establish the falsification, the debt disappears." "That takes time," she said. "We have 30 days. How fast can the Billings lawyer move?" She thought for a moment. "If I write today and send by wire..." "Then write today," he said. and send by wire. She looked at him for a long moment. "You're not leaving," she said. It was not entirely a question. "I just came back from jail, Margaret. I think we've established I'm not easy to move." She exhaled. It was a short, sharp sound, almost a laugh, and also almost not, and also something else entirely, that she didn't have a name for, and wasn't going to search for one just now. "There's a telegraph office in Milford," she said. "I'll write in tomorrow morning. I'll have the wire written tonight." "All right." She picked up the letter again, read it once more, and then set it face down on the table, a deliberate gesture. The gesture of a woman declining to let a piece of paper occupy more of her attention than she chooses to give it. "He escalated," she said. "The jail didn't work, so he escalated." "Yes, which means he's feeling pressure." She said this as if the information were useful, which for Margaret it was, because she understood instinctively that a man who escalates quickly is a man who believes the opportunity is closing, and a man who believes the opportunity is closing has made a miscalculation. "He thought you were alone," Ethan said. "He thought I was alone," she confirmed. She stood up from the table and went to her writing desk, and she took out paper and a pen, and she began to draft the wire message to her Billings attorney. And Ethan stayed at the table and watched her write with the specific focus of a woman who is doing the thing that comes next. Because that is what capable people do. When the world attacks, they do the thing that comes next. But there was something neither of them said. Both of them were aware that there was something neither of them said. $412 in 30 days. 83 of Ethan's wages. A lawyer in Billings who needed time they might not have. A county clerk who had been eating supper with Charles Whitmore every Thursday for 3 years. The situation was serious. It was more serious than the false arrest, because the false arrest had been a thing that could be disproven quickly. This was different. This was paper and official seals and legal processes that moved at their own speed and didn't care who was right until they'd taken the time to find out. And in the meantime, the clock was running. It was Hector who said it first that evening when Margaret had explained the situation to him in the simple and complete way she explained everything. Hector listened without interrupting. Then he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I have money." Margaret looked at him. 11 years of wages, Hector said. "I don't spend much. I have a little over $200 in a tin in my room." He said this flatly without ceremony, the way he said everything. "You need it." "Hector," Margaret said. "I'll get it," he said. "Hector. Margaret?" And it was the first time in 11 years Ethan had heard him use her first name without the misses. Just her name, said the way you say the name of something that is not negotiable. "I have watched you hold this place together for 6 years. I have watched you fix every broken thing and pay every bill and ask nobody for anything. Now something has come that is bigger than one person, and there are people here who want to help, and you are going to let them." Margaret was still. Hector looked at her with the absolute steadiness of a man who has decided. "Yes," he said. A long pause. "Yes," she said quietly. Hector nodded once and went to his room. Ethan watched Margaret. She was sitting very straight and her hands were flat on the table, and her expression was the particular expression of a person who has held something alone for so long that being offered help feels almost indistinguishable from being broken open. "Margaret," he said. She looked at him. "You don't have to carry it alone anymore," he said. "You know that." She was quiet for a moment that stretched long enough to have things in it. "I'm still learning that," she said. Her voice was quiet and honest and stripped of its usual composed precision, just the plain truth of it. "Take your time," he said. "We've got 30 days. The corner of her mouth moved. 29 now, she said. 29. He agreed. And Ethan felt sitting at the kitchen table of Hawthorne Ranch with Hector's tin of money on its way from the bunkhouse and a wire to Billings, half written on the desk, that what Whitmore had intended to be the end of something was in fact nothing of the kind. What Whitmore had intended to be the end of something had turned out to be the moment when the thing he was trying to destroy realized exactly how strong it was. He just didn't know yet what that was going to cost him. The wire went to Billings that Saturday morning. Ethan rode in before sunrise, handed Margaret's message to the telegraph operator, a young man named Ferris, who had the permanent ink stains of someone who handled other people's urgent communications all day, and had learned to treat all of them with equal professional calm, and waited while Ferris tapped it out. The message was concise, because Margaret was incapable of being otherwise even under pressure. It identified the situation, named the law firm in Helena, cited the specific tax years in question, and asked her Billings attorney, a man named Thomas Garrett, to begin an immediate inquiry into the county records and to advise on emergency legal remedies available under Montana territorial law. Ferris looked up when he finished. "Response could come same day if he's in the office," he said. "More likely Monday." "Monday," Ethan said. "Yes, sir." Ethan paid for the wire and stood outside the telegraph office for a moment in the early morning quiet of Milford, looking at the street, which was mostly empty at this hour, except for the liveryman across the way and a woman hurrying toward the bakery with a basket. He thought about 29 days. He thought about $412.83 of his wages, and Hector's 200 in the tin, which brought them to 283, still more than 100 short, and that assumed the attorney in Billings could not move fast enough to make the debt disappear before the 30 days expired, which was not a certainty either direction. He was turning to go back to his horse when a voice said, "Mr. Walker?" He turned. Sheriff Ben Calloway was standing on the boardwalk outside his office 2 doors down, with a coffee cup in his hand and an expression that had something unresolved in it. Ethan walked toward him. "Sheriff?" Calloway looked at his coffee cup. "I've been thinking," Calloway said, "about the complaint, about how it was filed." "I would imagine so," Ethan said. "Gerald Poole filed that paperwork," Calloway said. "The county clerk. He signed Henderson's name on the complaint form." He paused. "That's not legal." "No," Ethan agreed. "It isn't." "I went to see Poole yesterday afternoon," Calloway said. "Asked him to explain himself." A pause that was full of things. "He said Whitmore told him the complaint was routine and that Henderson had verbally authorized it and that the paperwork was just a formality." "And did you find that convincing?" Calloway looked at him. "No," he said. "I did not find that convincing." He drank his coffee. "I also found it notable that Poole has been buying drinks at the saloon considerably above his county clerk's salary for the past 8 months. Ethan was quiet. "What are you going to do with that sheriff?" Calloway set his coffee cup down on the railing. "I'm going to have a conversation with the territorial marshal's office in Helena," he said, "on Monday, about certain patterns of activity in this county that may warrant a formal inquiry." Ethan looked at him for a long moment. "I appreciate that," he said. "I was used," Calloway said, and his voice was flat and direct about it, no self-pity, just the honest acknowledgement of a man squaring accounts. "My office was used. That has consequences." Ethan nodded once. "Good luck, Sheriff," he said. He rode back to the ranch. He told Margaret about Calloway as soon as he arrived, sitting at the kitchen table while she finished the morning accounts, and she listened with the precise attention she gave to all information that had strategic value, which this clearly did. "Calloway going to the marshal's office," she said. "That changes things." "It adds pressure to Whitmore from a direction he didn't anticipate," Ethan said. "He built this assuming Calloway would do his job and go no further. He didn't account for Calloway having enough self-respect to be angry about being used. Most people would," Margaret said. "Whitmore's mistake is that he looks at people and sees their utility, not their character. He knows Calloway follows procedure. He doesn't know what Calloway will do when the procedure was the thing that was corrupted." She paused. "That's a significant blind spot." "It is," Ethan said. Emma appeared in the kitchen doorway, having apparently been listening from the hallway for an indeterminate amount of time. "Are we winning?" she said. Margaret looked at her. "We are not losing," she said. Emma considered this assessment. "That means we're winning," she said. "It means we're not losing," Margaret repeated. There is a difference. Come in or go out, but don't stand in the doorway. Emma came in. She sat down at the table with the air of someone who has decided she is a participant in this conversation, now, whether she was invited or not, and neither Ethan nor Margaret told her otherwise, because Emma Walker, at the kitchen table of Hawthorne Ranch, had become in a matter of weeks simply part of what the kitchen table of Hawthorne Ranch looked like. The man who did all of this, Emma said. Mr. Whitmore, what happens to him? That depends on what we can prove, Margaret said. We can prove plenty, Emma said. You have your records. Sheriff Calloway has his own reasons. And Hector... She paused. Hector said this morning that he's been watching Whitmore operate in this county for 8 years, and he knows things. He said he knows things he hasn't said yet because nobody asked. Margaret and Ethan looked at each other. Then Margaret said, Tell Hector I'd like to speak with him when he comes in for lunch. Emma slid off her chair, went to the back door, opened it, and shouted Hector's name into the yard with a volume that was in Ethan's private assessment, genuinely impressive for someone her size. A pause. Hector's voice from across the yard. What? Emma. Margaret wants to speak with you at lunch. A longer pause. Hector. I'll be there. Emma came back inside with the satisfied expression of a task completed. Done, she said. Hector arrived at the kitchen table at noon with dust on his jacket and the look of a man who has been thinking about something for a while and has decided to say it. He sat down. He looked at Margaret. I know things about Whitmore's operations in this county, he said. Without preamble, because Hector never used preamble. Things I saw. Things men talked about when they thought I wasn't listening or thought I didn't matter enough to be careful around. He paused. I am going to tell you all of it. Please, Margaret said. So Hector talked. He talked for 20 minutes, which was more consecutive talking than Ethan had heard from Hector in 5 weeks combined, and what came out of it was a careful, detailed account of things Hector had witnessed or been told over 8 years of working near the edges of Whitmore's sphere of influence in Creston County. He talked about a homestead family named Vickers, who had lost their property to a tax lien 5 years ago, under circumstances that looked in retrospect very similar to what Margaret was now facing. He talked about a rancher named Cole, who had been driven out the year before by a combination of false debt claims and what Cole had called accidents, fence cuts, a barn fire of disputed origin, and who had sold his property to Whitmore for half its value just to make it stop. He talked about Gerald Poole, the county clerk, and the fact that Poole had been in Whitmore's employ in a strictly unofficial capacity since at least 1884, and that Hector knew this because Hector had seen Poole at Whitmore's house on a Sunday evening and had heard enough of what was said through an open window to understand what kind of arrangement they had. Margaret had stopped eating. She was writing. She had produced a piece of paper from somewhere and was taking notes in her precise hand, asking Hector occasional clarifying questions, dates, names, specific details, and Hector answered each one with the specificity of a man who had stored this information carefully, because he had known, with the particular instinct of someone who has watched injustice operate for long enough, that a day would come when it would be needed. When Hector finished, the paper was full. Margaret looked at what she'd written. This is enough, she said. Enough for what? Ethan asked. Enough to take to the territorial marshal's office myself, Margaret said. Not to wait for Calloway, not to depend on the speed of anyone else's process. Enough to go directly to the marshal and present a pattern of conduct that constitutes criminal fraud, official corruption, and coercion across multiple properties and multiple years. She looked at Hector. You'll swear to this? Yes, Hector said without hesitation. In writing, notarized if needed before a judge. Yes. Hector, Margaret said, and her voice had something in it that she almost never allowed her voice to have, the particular quality of someone who is genuinely profoundly grateful and is not going to perform it, but cannot quite keep it entirely contained. Why did you wait? Hector was quiet for a moment. Because before now, he said, there was no one to go with you. The kitchen was very still. Ethan looked at Hector. Hector didn't look back. He picked up his fork and resumed eating as if he had said something perfectly ordinary. Margaret looked down at her paper. She pressed her lips together briefly just once. Then she looked up at Ethan. "Can you manage the ranch for 3 days?" she said. "I need to go to Helena." "I can manage the ranch," he said. "Hector will go with me. His testimony in person will carry more weight than a written statement." "I know. Go. Emma." "Emma will be here," Ethan said. "She'll be fine. We'll manage." Margaret looked at him for a moment with the expression he had come to know best, the one that was not a smile exactly, but was what happened in the space where a smile would be if she let herself produce one freely. "I'll leave in the morning," she said. She left in the morning. Ethan watched the wagon take the road east toward Milford, and from there toward the stage line that connected to Helena, and he stood at the fence post and watched it until it was out of sight, which took longer than it should have because he didn't look away. Emma stood beside him. "She'll be back," Emma said. "She will." Ethan agreed. "She's not the kind of person who doesn't come back," Emma said. "She's the kind who goes and does the thing and comes back with it done." Ethan looked down at his daughter. "When did you get so perceptive?" "I've always been perceptive," Emma said. "You just stopped being surprised by it." He almost smiled. "Come on," he said. "Duchess isn't going to feed herself." "She would if she could figure out where the grain is kept," Emma said darkly, "and I think she's working on it." They went to the chicken yard. The 3 days were long in the specific way that days are long when you are waiting for something and cannot speed it up. Ethan worked the ranch with the focused attention of a man who needs his hands busy to keep his mind from running ahead of what he knows. He repaired the south pasture water trough, which had been developing a slow leak he'd been watching for 2 weeks. He rehinged the barn's east door, which had been dropping on one side and dragging on the ground. He moved the cattle to the west pasture, where the grass was still good, and checked each animal for signs of the foot rot that had been showing up in a neighboring spread's herd. He cooked, which he was adequate at, and Emma helped, which made it take longer, but produced better results because Emma had been absorbing Margaret's kitchen techniques with the same focused attention she gave to everything worth learning. On the second evening, sitting on the porch after Emma was in bed, Ethan found himself talking to the empty chair where Margaret usually sat, not out loud, just in his head, running through things he would have said to her if she'd been there. Observations about the cattle about a fence section he wanted to extend in the spring, about a plan he'd been developing for the October drive that he thought might get them a better price in Billings. He stopped himself when he realized what he was doing. He examined it carefully. He had spent 2 years being careful. Careful with Emma, careful with hope, careful with anything that looked like it might be something he could lose. He had built his careful life into a structure that was functional and protective, and that Emma could rely on, and he had done it by not allowing himself anything that couldn't survive being taken away. But something had happened at Hawthorne Ranch that his careful structure had not fully accounted for. Something had slipped past the defenses, not by force, but by gradual accumulation. A woman at a stove, a woman at a kitchen table, a woman on a porch in the dark, who didn't fill silences unnecessarily. A woman who said, "I know," with a speed and completeness that meant she had already decided to believe him, before the question of whether to believe him had even fully formed. He sat on the porch and looked at the Montana sky, and admitted to himself with the precise honesty of a man who has decided that self-deception is too expensive that he was in love with Margaret Hawthorne. He then sat with that admission for a considerable amount of time. He did not know what to do with it that was fair to her, or that didn't risk the thing they had built, the arrangement, the family, the particular structure of warmth and practicality, and shared purpose that Emma depended on, and that he depended on, more than he'd understood until just now. He also did not know if she felt anything of the kind. He thought about the almost smiles. He thought about the way she'd said his name the morning the sheriff came Ethan for the first time without planning it. He thought about a dozen small things he'd been storing without meaning to, the way you gather evidence before you know you're making a case. He thought about what he was going to say. He had no idea what he was going to say. Margaret came back on the fourth day instead of the third, which was not unexpected, but which produced in Ethan's chest approximately 2 hours of a feeling he could only describe as the specific misery of waiting for something you cannot influence. Emma spotted the wagon first from the kitchen window. "She's back," she announced with the particular satisfaction of someone whose prediction has been confirmed, and went out the back door at speed. Ethan followed at a more controlled pace, which fooled no one. Margaret was climbing down from the wagon seat when Emma reached her, and she caught Emma's momentum with the ease of long practice. She had been catching Emma's momentum for 7 weeks now, and had adapted to it the way you adapt to anything real and reliable. Hector descended from the other side of the wagon with the dignity of a man who has been sitting for a day and a half and has strong feelings about it. Ethan looked at Margaret's face. She was tired, really tired, the specific tiredness of intense travel combined with intense work. But underneath the tiredness, there was something else. Something that sat differently than the controlled, careful composure she usually wore. Something that looked like the aftermath of a thing done. "Tell me," he said. "Come inside," she said. "I'll tell you everything." They went inside. Emma positioned herself at the table with the transparent strategy of someone who intends to be present for this conversation and would prefer not to have her presence questioned. Margaret sat down and folded her hands on the table and looked at Ethan. "Thomas Garrett, my billings attorney, met us in Helena," she said. "He had already been in contact with the territorial marshal's office based on my wire. When Hector and I arrived, we spent most of the first day providing sworn statements. Hector's account combined with the Vickers and Cole cases that Garrett had already begun pulling records on was enough for the marshal to open a formal investigation into Gerald Poole and Charles Whitmore." Ethan was quiet. "Poole was suspended from his position pending investigation," Margaret continued. "Yesterday morning, the marshal's office sent a deputy to Milford to execute the suspension and to sequester the county records for examination." "Whitmore," Ethan asked, "has been formally notified that he is the subject of a territorial fraud investigation," Margaret said. "He has not been arrested, not yet. But Garrett believes that once the records examination is complete and the pattern of altered documents is established, which he expects to take 2 to 3 weeks, there will be grounds for criminal charges." She paused. "The Helena law firm that sent the tax demand letter has been notified that their client is under investigation and that the underlying records that generated the demand are suspected of being fraudulent. They withdrew the demand yesterday afternoon." Ethan stared at her. "They withdrew it," he said. "Yesterday afternoon," she repeated. "In writing. Garrett has the letter." Emma's fist hit the table. "Yes," she said with a force that rattled the coffee cups. Hector at the kitchen counter made the sound that was his version of a laugh. Ethan looked at Margaret. Margaret looked back at him. "It's not finished," she said. "The investigation will take time. Whitmore has resources and he'll fight. But the tax demand is gone, and the formal investigation is open, and he cannot use Gerald Poole anymore because Poole is suspended and under investigation himself." She paused. "The machinery he was using against us has been dismantled." "You did that in 3 days," Ethan said. "Hector built it in 8 years," Margaret said. "I just carried it to the right place." Hector made a dismissive sound from the kitchen counter. "You knew who to talk to," he said. "You knew how to talk to them. I just told the truth." "Telling the truth to the right people at the right moment is not a small thing," Margaret said. Hector turned away, which was his method of accepting a compliment. Emma had been watching this exchange with her chin in both hands, her elbows on the table, in the posture of someone watching something they intend to remember. "Whitmore really thought he was going to win," she said. "Didn't he?" "He's been winning for a long time," Margaret said. "Against people who were fighting alone. Against people who didn't have documentation or legal representation or—" She stopped. "Or what?" Emma asked. Margaret looked at Ethan. "Or anyone to stand beside them," she said. The kitchen was quiet for a moment. Then Ethan said, "I'll start supper." He stood and went to the stove because he needed to do something with his hands, and because what Margaret had just said was sitting in his chest, in a way that required some private managing. Emma looked at Margaret. Margaret looked at Emma. Emma said at a volume she probably believed was whispered but was not. "Are you going to tell him?" Margaret's expression shifted. "Emma," she said. "Because he doesn't know," Emma said. "He thinks he's hiding it, but he's not very good at it, and you're not very good at it either, but you're better than him." "Emma," Margaret said again, and her voice had more warning in it now. "I'm just saying," Emma said, and picked up her cup with the serene expression of someone who has said what they meant to say and is comfortable with the consequences. From the stove, Ethan said nothing. He was very focused on the stove. He heard Margaret say quietly to Emma, "This is not a conversation to have in front of your father." And Emma said, "Then when?" And there was a silence. That evening after supper, after Emma was in bed after Ethan had read to her until she fell asleep, which happened faster than usual because she had apparently been running on excitement all day and crashed hard. Once the excitement was spent, he came out to the porch and found Margaret in her chair. He sat in the other chair. The night was clear and big, in the way Montana nights were, the sky doing more than any sky had a right to do. "Emma said something to you," he said. "In the kitchen." "She did," Margaret said. "She says things," Ethan said. "She's 6, and she says things, and they're not always. She means well, but she—" "Ethan," Margaret said. He stopped. "She's right," Margaret said. The air between them changed. Ethan kept his eyes on the sky. "Margaret," he said carefully, "I'm not asking you for anything," she said. Her voice was the direct, precise voice, but with something underneath it that wasn't usually there, something open, something that had decided to be honest regardless of the risk. "I'm not putting anything on you. I know what you've been carrying, and I know this was not what either of us planned for when you knocked on that door." "No," he said. "It wasn't. But I want to be honest with you," she said, "because I think you deserve that, and because I am not a woman who is good at being dishonest about things that matter to me." He turned to look at her. She was looking at the sky, not at him, which told him this was costing her something, this honesty, even though she had chosen it. "You have become something to me," she said. "You and Emma both. And I don't mean the ranch. The ranch was mine before you arrived, and it'll be mine after. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about—" She stopped, and for the first time, he watched her search for words, this woman who always had them precisely arranged. "I had stopped expecting anything," she said finally. "I had stopped expecting the particular thing that you have turned out to be." Ethan was quiet. "What thing is that?" he asked. She looked at him then. "Someone I trust," she said. "It sounds simple. It isn't." He held her gaze. He thought about what he had admitted to himself on this same porch 2 nights ago in the dark, talking to the empty chair. He thought about Clara and the promise and 2 years of careful structures. He thought about Emma saying he's not very good at hiding it. He thought about the specific sound of a woman believing him instantly. "I know," without needing a reason, because she had already decided the kind of man he was. "I have been careful for 2 years," he said. "About everything. About allowing myself—" He stopped. "About hope. I got careful about hope, because hope is expensive when you have a 6-year-old who is watching everything you do." "I understand that," she said. "I know you do." He looked at his hands. "What I discovered 2 nights ago sitting in this chair is that I have not been as careful as I thought." She was very still. "Margaret," he said, "I am not good at this. I have not had cause to be for 2 years, but I think you deserve the same honesty you gave me." "Yes, yes," he said. "I'm in that same place. Whatever that place is, I don't know what to do with it that's fair to you, given everything this situation already has given Emma and the ranch and all of it. But you told me so, I'll tell you. That's where I am." The porch was quiet. Margaret exhaled. It was a long, slow breath, the release of something that had been held with great precision for a long time. "We don't have to know what to do with it tonight," she said. "No," he agreed. "It can just be true for now." "Yes." A pause. "Is that enough for now?" he asked. She thought about it genuinely. Actually thought about it, which was exactly like her. "Yes," she said. "It's more than I expected, so yes." They sat in the big Montana night and didn't say anything else for a while because they had both said what needed saying, and what surrounded the words now was not emptiness, but something warm and careful and new. Something that didn't need to be rushed or explained or turned into anything more than it was right this moment. And right this moment, it was enough. What they didn't know, what neither of them could have known on that quiet porch, was that Charles Whitmore, in his large house on the edge of Milford, was not a man who accepted what had happened in Helena as the end of the matter. He was a man who, when the first method failed, found a second method. And the second method was already in motion. It arrived in Milford the following morning, in the form of a man on a black horse carrying papers from a district judge in Billings, papers that had nothing to do with the territorial marshal's investigation, papers that had to do with something older and more specific, and something that Charles Whitmore had been holding in reserve. A final move, the kind of move that a man makes when he has decided that if he cannot have what he wants, he will make sure that the people who stopped him understand what losing actually costs. Sheriff Calloway read the papers. Then he rode out to Hawthorne Ranch for the second time in 2 weeks. And this time, he was not coming for Ethan. Sheriff Calloway rode onto Hawthorne Ranch with the particular posture of a man who has been given a task he does not want and cannot refuse, and Ethan saw it from the barn before Calloway had even reached the house. He knew that posture. He had seen it 10 days ago when Calloway had come for him, and the shape of it, the straight back that was not confident but armored the set of the jaw that was not resolute but braced, was the same now as it had been then. A man doing his job against his better judgment. Ethan came out of the barn. Calloway pulled up and looked at him. "I need to speak with Mrs. Hawthorne," Calloway said. "She's inside." "I know." A pause. "Mr. Walker, I want you to know that I did not go looking for this, and I take no satisfaction in it." "What is it?" Ethan said. Calloway reached into his coat and produced a document folded sealed with a court stamp, the kind of paper that has weight to it, not because of what it's made of, but because of what's written inside. "It's a civil petition," Calloway said, "filed in district court in Billings. Whitmore's attorney filed it 2 days ago before the marshal's investigation was opened, which means it predates the investigation and can proceed independently of it." He paused. "It's a petition contesting the legal title to the Hawthorne property. Whitmore's attorney is claiming that the original land grant issued to Robert Hawthorne in 1876 contained a surveying error that placed approximately 40 acres of the property's western boundary incorrectly, and that those 40 acres were therefore legally part of a parcel that was subsequently purchased by Whitmore's holding company in 1882. Ethan stared at him. "He's claiming he already owns part of her land," he said. "He's claiming the title is clouded," Calloway said carefully, "which is different from a direct claim, but the legal effect is similar. A clouded title means the property cannot be sold, cannot be used as collateral, and in some interpretations triggers a mandatory court review of the entire land grant." He paused. "Garrett, Mrs. Hawthorne's attorney, will have received the same filing by now, but the court date is in 3 weeks. 3 weeks, Ethan said. Yes. Ethan looked at the document in Calloway's hand. He thought about Whitmore sitting in his large house on the edge of Milford, having received the news from Helena, having absorbed the fact that his fraud investigation had been exposed, and his county clerk suspended, and his tax demand withdrawn. He thought about Whitmore deciding what to do next. And he thought about the particular kind of mind that when it loses one weapon reaches immediately for another, a weapon it had been holding in reserve all along. A weapon it was saving for exactly this contingency filed 2 days before the Helena trip, so that even the successful outcome of that trip couldn't stop what was already in motion. This was not improvisation. This was a plan that had a second layer. Whitmore had expected to lose the first engagement. He had built the second one before the first one was even finished. "I'll take it inside," Ethan said. He took the document from Calloway's hand, and he carried it up the porch steps, and he opened the door, and he stood in the kitchen doorway, and Margaret looked up from the table and saw his face. And she was already standing before he said a word. He set the document on the table. She picked it up. She read it. She read it twice, the way she read everything important, once for comprehension, once for implication. Then she set it down. She put both hands flat on the table, which he had come to understand was her physical method of steadying herself, of making contact with something solid when the world was doing something she needed to absorb. Emma was in the sitting room. Neither of them said anything about Emma being in the sitting room, but both of them modulated what came next, with the awareness that Emma was 30 feet away and had ears like a barn cat. "He filed it before Helena?" Ethan said quietly. "Yes," Margaret said. "He planned for us to win in Helena. He knew Hector's testimony would be sufficient if it reached the right people. He planned for that, and he prepared this." She looked at the document. "This is the move he's been waiting 10 years to make." The survey error. "There have been questions about the western boundary since Robert bought the property," Margaret said. Robert's attorney at the time said the questions were minor and unlikely to generate any legal challenge, and I believed him, and I should not have believed him as completely as I did. Her voice was steady but tight. "Whitmore has known about the survey discrepancy for years. He bought that parcel in 1882 specifically because it abutted the questioned boundary. He has been holding this petition in reserve since before Robert died." Ethan looked at her. "He's been planning this for 10 years, he said. "At least," she said. A silence. "Can Garrett fight it?" "Garrett can fight anything," she said. "But a title dispute in district court is not 3 days in Helena with a marshal. This is months. This is depositions and surveys and competing legal interpretations, and a judge who may or may not be in Whitmore's pocket. And while it goes on, the title is clouded, and the operation is in legal uncertainty, and the Billings cattle drive." She stopped. "Margaret." She looked at him. "The cattle drive is in 6 weeks," she said. "If the title is under court dispute, the Billings buyers will pull their contracts. They won't take cattle off disputed land. It's standard practice." She paused. "Without the drive revenue, I cannot cover operating costs through winter." The kitchen was very quiet. "He knows that," Ethan said. "He knows everything about how this ranch operates," she said. "He has been watching it for 10 years. He knows the drive is the annual revenue, and he knows the timing, and he filed this petition to land exactly here, exactly at the point where it does the maximum damage, regardless of whether he wins the underlying legal argument." Ethan was quiet. He was thinking. He was thinking about the survey. About 40 acres of western boundary. About a land grant from 1876, and a parcel purchase in 1882, and a man who had been building this particular trap for a decade. He was also thinking about something Hector had said 3 days ago. He pushed back from the table. "Where's Hector?" he said. "Still unhitching the horses from—" Ethan was already at the back door. He found Hector at the corral, and he said without a greeting, because there wasn't time for one, "The western boundary of this property. The 40 acres Whitmore is claiming the survey misplaced. Do you know that land?" Hector looked at him. "I've worked it for 11 years, Hector said. "Is there anything on it? Any structure, any improvement, any evidence of use that predates Whitmore's 1882 parcel purchase?" Hector was still. Then something moved in his expression. A slow, specific recognition, the look of a man pulling something up from deep storage. "The fence," Hector said. "What fence?" "The Western Line fence," Hector said. "The original one. Robert built it in 1878, 2 years after the land grant, before Whitmore bought anything near here." He paused. "I helped build it. I was 29 years old and Robert paid me $3 a day, and I set every third post myself." Ethan stared at him. "That fence is still there." "The posts are still in the ground," Hector said. "The wire has been replaced twice, but the original posts' cedar hand cut are still in the ground. You can see the original marks on them. Robert notched every post on the property line with his brand. A reverse H." Hector's voice was absolutely steady. Every post. Every 40 yards. For the entire western boundary. Ethan took 1 second to absorb this. That fence predates Whitmore's claim by 4 years, he said. By 4 years, Hector confirmed. And you witnessed the construction. I participated in the construction, Hector said. There is a difference. Ethan put his hand on Hector's shoulder for a moment, just contact the specific gesture of a man who cannot find words adequate to the situation. Then he went back inside. Margaret was still at the table. He told her about the fence posts. He watched her face change as he talked, not dramatically, not with the sudden brightness of hope, because Margaret did not work that way. It changed the way a door opens when the right key is used precisely incrementally and then all the way. When he finished, she was quiet for 3 seconds. The original survey marker is still at the southwest corner, she said. Robert buried it. It's a granite stone with the survey date and the surveyor's name cut into it. I've seen it every time I've walked that boundary, which I do twice a year. Garrett needs both, Ethan said. The posts and the marker. Physical evidence of the original boundary as it was staked and built upon before Whitmore's purchase. Physical evidence that predates any claim he can make, Margaret said. Yes. She stood up. I'm wiring Garrett right now, she said. She was already moving to the desk. Emma appeared in the doorway. She had apparently decided that the length of the silence from the sitting room had exceeded acceptable limits, and investigation was warranted. She looked at Ethan. She looked at Margaret. She read the room the way she read everything quickly and accurately. What happened? She said. Ethan looked at her. Whitmore made another move, he said. What kind? The legal kind. He's claiming part of this land was never properly Margaret's to begin with. Emma's expression went through several things in rapid sequence, landing on something that was not fear, but was the precursor to determination, the face of someone who has decided that what they are feeling is not going to be despair, but its opposite. But it is hers, Emma said. She's been here for years. The fence is here. Everything is here. We know that, Ethan said. We're going to prove it. How long will that take? As long as it takes, Ethan said. But we're going to prove it. Emma looked at him with the specific expression she used when she was deciding whether to believe something, the expression that was part Clara and part herself and part something entirely her own. Then she nodded. Okay, she said. What do I do? Right now, let Margaret work. Emma looked at Margaret, who was writing at the desk with the focused intensity of a woman who has found the thread and is following it as fast as she can. She's fast when she's determined, Emma observed. She's always determined, Ethan said. True, Emma said. But this is a different speed. She went back to the sitting room, and Ethan heard her settle, and he understood that Emma had made a decision to be steady, to take up as little of the household's available worry as possible, which was something she did sometimes, contracted herself down to a smaller, quieter presence when the adults around her needed the space. It was one of the things about Emma that made his chest ache sometimes. She had learned that from 2 years of watching him do the same thing. The wire went to Billings that afternoon. Garrett's response came the following morning. It was longer than a typical wire. Ferris at the telegraph office told Ethan when he came to collect it that it was the longest wire he'd sent in 6 months, and it said in the compressed language of telegraph communication that Garrett had already reviewed the filing, that the physical evidence described original boundary fence, predating the 1882 parcel purchase, notched cedar posts with the Hawthorne brand original survey marker constituted what he called clear priority evidence of established use and ownership, that he was filing an immediate response in district court challenging the standing of Whitmore's petition on the grounds of established adverse possession and prior construction, and that he was requesting an emergency evidentiary hearing before the court date to present the physical evidence in situ. In situ meant at the fence line, meant that a judge would come to the ranch. Margaret read the wire at the kitchen table and set it down and said, "He's requesting the judge come here to see the fence posts himself," Ethan said. Garrett says physical evidence presented at the site carries more weight than survey documents presented in a courtroom, she said. particularly with the notched brand. A judge can see a notch in a cedar post. He can see a survey stone. Those are harder to argue against than competing measurements on paper. When he's requesting the hearing within 10 days, Margaret said, before the official court date. If the judge grants it, will he? Garrett thinks yes, she said. The judge in this district is a man named Harlan Cross. Garrett says Cross is meticulous and dislikes procedural manipulation. The fact that this petition was filed before the criminal fraud investigation time to survive it is exactly the kind of maneuver Cross responds poorly to. Garrett knows this judge, Ethan said. Garrett has practiced before every judge in this territory for 22 years, Margaret said. That's why I hired him. The emergency hearing was granted. It was granted in 4 days, which was fast enough that Whitmore's attorney filed an objection to the speed of it, which Cross denied, which Margaret said was itself a signal about how Cross felt about the situation. The hearing was set for a Tuesday. The Sunday before the hearing, something happened that none of them expected. Frank Henderson rode onto Hawthorne Ranch. He was alone on a gray horse, and he looked like a man who had been arguing with himself for 2 weeks and had finally reached a conclusion he wasn't entirely comfortable with, but had decided was necessary. He asked to speak with Margaret. Margaret came to the porch, and Henderson took off his hat. "Mrs. Hawthorne," he said, "I owe you an apology." She looked at him. "My name was on that complaint against your man Walker," Henderson said. "I know you know I didn't authorize it. I know the whole county knows it now. But I want to say to your face that I am sorry my name was used that way, and I am sorry I didn't look more carefully at what Whitmore's man was telling me before I let him walk away believing I'd agreed to something I hadn't." "Mr. Henderson," Margaret said. "I know it don't fix anything," Henderson said, "but I've been thinking about the Vickers family and the Cole place, and I've been thinking about the fact that Whitmore's been operating in this county for 10 years, and most of us knew something wasn't right, and none of us said so, because none of it touched us directly." He paused. "That's on us as much as it's on him." Margaret looked at him for a long moment. "Will you say that to the marshal's investigator?" she asked. Henderson didn't hesitate. "Already did," he said. "Thursday. Rode to Milford and told him everything I could remember about how Whitmore's man approached me and what was said and what wasn't." He paused. "Told him about a couple other things too. Things I'd noticed over the years and kept quiet about." "Thank you," Margaret said. "Don't thank me," Henderson said. "It's just right." He put his hat back on. "Good luck Tuesday, Mrs. Hawthorne." He rode away. Ethan stood beside Margaret on the porch and watched him go. "People are braver when they're not alone," Margaret said quietly. "Yes," Ethan said. "They are." She looked at him sideways. "You did that," she said. "I didn't do anything." "You stayed," she said. "And staying changed what was possible here. For Henderson. For Calloway. For Hector." She paused. "For me." He held her gaze. "For me too," he said. Tuesday came with the particular weight of days that matter. Judge Harlan Cross arrived at Hawthorne Ranch at 9 in the morning with his clerk Thomas Garrett and a surveyor that Garrett had hired independently to provide a professional assessment of the boundary evidence. Whitmore's attorney, a man named Prescott, silver-haired, expensive suit. The practiced ease of someone who had won many courtroom arguments, arrived 20 minutes later with his own surveyor and a leather case full of documents. Whitmore himself did not come. Ethan noted this. Margaret noticed him note it. They did not discuss it then, but later they would agree that Whitmore's absence was the first signal a man confident of victory comes to watch it. A man uncertain of victory sends representatives. They walked the western boundary, all of them in a loose group with the two surveyors taking measurements, and Garrett narrating and Prescott offering objections in a careful legal voice, and Judge Cross listening to everything with the particular quality of attention of someone who has heard many arguments and is interested only in what is real. The first fence post was 40 yards from the southwest corner. It was a cedar post, hand-cut, weathered 11 years, but solid cedar weathers, hard. It was why Robert had used it, and on the south face of the post at eye level was a notch. Clean-cut, deliberate, unmistakable. Inside the notch still visible after 11 years, the pressed mark of a branding iron shaped like a reverse H. Garrett said, "This post was placed in 1878, Your Honor, 2 years after the original land grant, and 4 years before Mr. Whitmore's purchase of the adjacent parcel." My witness, Mr. Hector Reyes, participated in the installation of this fence line and can attest to the date of construction, the method used, and the identity of every post he personally set. Cross looked at the post. He looked at it for a long time. Then he looked at Hector. "You set this post," Cross said. "Yes, sir," Hector said. "September of 1878. Robert Hawthorne paid me $3 a day for 14 days to build this line. I set every third post myself. This one was mine." "You're certain it was this post and not another?" "I'm certain of this section of the line," Hector said. "I can walk you to the other posts I set and describe what I found when I dug each hole, if it would help you." Cross looked at him. "How do you remember that kind of detail after 11 years?" he said. "Because I built it well," Hector said simply. "A man remembers the things he built well." Cross moved to the southwest corner. The survey stone was there. It was granite half buried by 11 years of soil movement and grass growth, and Ethan had spent an hour on Saturday cleaning the face of it with a brush so that the cut letters were clearly visible. The survey date, April 1876. The surveyor's name, Thomas Birch. The parcel description matching the original Hawthorne land grant. Cross crouched down. He looked at the stone for almost a minute. Prescott beside him said, "Your Honor, a survey stone doesn't resolve the mathematical discrepancy in the original measurement." "Mr. Prescott," Cross said without looking up, "I am looking at an original survey marker placed in 1876, consistent with the granted land description. I am looking at a boundary fence, constructed in 1878 within the granted parcel 2 years before your client had any interest in this county. I am looking at consistent physical evidence of ownership, occupation, and improvement spanning 11 years. He stood. What mathematical discrepancy are you asking me to weigh against that? Prescott's prepared arguments met something they had not been built to handle. Not a legal counter-argument, but a simple physical undeniable reality standing in the Montana ground. He tried anyway. He cited the measurement documents. He cited the 1882 parcel deed. He cited 3 cases from other territories involving competing boundary surveys. Cross listened to all of it. Then Cross looked at Whitmore's surveyor. "Your professional assessment," Cross said. "Looking at what you see here, looking at these posts and this stone and the physical relationship between this boundary and the adjacent parcel. What is your professional assessment?" Whitmore's surveyor, a careful man, a professional man, a man who had presumably been told what conclusion he was expected to reach, looked at the fence line and the stone and the surrounding land. He was quiet for a long moment. He said, "The physical evidence is consistent with the original grant boundary as described. If there is a mathematical discrepancy in the original survey measurement, the established construction suggests it was either corrected in practice or falls within acceptable margin." He paused. "In my professional opinion, the boundary as physically established predates any competing claim." Prescott stared at his own surveyor. Cross said nothing. He simply wrote something in the notebook his clerk carried. They walked back to the ranch house. Cross sat at Margaret's kitchen table, the same table where everything in the past 7 weeks had been decided and eaten and talked through and held together, and he reviewed his notes for 10 minutes while everyone waited. Then he looked up. "I am dismissing the petition," Cross said. "The physical evidence of prior construction and established use is clear, consistent, and uncontradicted by anything in the petitioner's filing that rises above the level of mathematical speculation. The boundary as established stands. The Hawthorne title is clear." He looked at Prescott. I will also be noting in my written order that this petition was filed at a time and in a manner consistent with an attempt to create legal pressure on a property owner during an active criminal fraud investigation into the petitioner, and I will be forwarding that notation to the Territorial Marshal's office." Prescott said nothing. Cross closed his notebook. He looked at Margaret. "Mrs. Hawthorne," he said, "your land is your land." Margaret said, "Thank you, Your Honor." Her voice was completely steady. Her hands under the table, where no one could see them, were shaking. Ethan could tell because she pressed them flat against her thighs the way she pressed them flat against the table when she needed something solid. He reached under the table and put his hand over hers. She went still for a moment. Then she turned her hand over and held his. They sat like that while Cross and his clerk gathered their things and Garrett spoke with Prescott in the clipped professional language of lawyers, communicating the conclusion of a fight. And Hector stood by the kitchen door with his arms crossed and his chin up, the posture of a man who has done what he set out to do and is satisfied with the quality of the work. Emma appeared from the sitting room. She looked at the judge's departing back. She looked at Garrett's expression. She looked at Ethan's face, and then at Margaret's face, and at their hands. She had the perceptiveness to read all of it at once. "We won," she said. "We won," Ethan said. Emma sat down on the kitchen floor. Just sat down right there cross-legged on the kitchen floor, like the news had taken the bones from her legs in the best possible way. "Okay," she said to the floor. "Okay." Margaret looked at her. Then Margaret slid off her chair and sat down on the kitchen floor beside Emma. It was so unexpected Margaret Hawthorne, who was always upright, always contained, always load-bearing, that for a moment no one moved. Emma looked at her. Margaret looked at Emma. Then Emma leaned sideways into Margaret's shoulder, and Margaret put her arm around Emma, and they sat on the kitchen floor together in the aftermath of the thing, and Margaret closed her eyes and pressed her cheek against the top of Emma's head. Ethan stood up. He crossed to the kitchen floor and sat down on Emma's other side. The three of them sat on the kitchen floor of Hawthorne Ranch, and Hector looked at them for a moment and then turned and went outside, because he had the dignity and good sense to know when a moment did not need an audience. They sat there for a while. Nobody said anything, because there was nothing that needed saying, because some moments are complete in themselves, and adding words to them is like adding something to a thing that is already whole. After a while, Emma said quietly into the space between them, "Are we going to be okay?" Ethan looked over her head at Margaret. Margaret looked back at him. "Yes," Margaret said. And then, because she was Margaret and she did not make statements, she did not mean, "We are going to be more than okay." Emma exhaled. Ethan felt it, the actual physical exhale of a 6-year-old who has been bracing against something for longer than she knew and has finally been given permission to stop. He put his arm around her from the other side. The weeks that followed moved the way good things move, not in dramatic moments, but in the accumulation of ordinary ones. The Billings cattle drive went on schedule on clear title with all contracts honored. The revenue came in above what Margaret had projected because Ethan had suggested a route change that brought them to market 2 days earlier than usual and caught a price advantage that more than compensated for the additional distance. Charles Whitmore was formally charged by the Territorial Marshal's office in October. Gerald Poole had provided a detailed statement in exchange for reduced charges, and that statement, combined with Hector's testimony and the documented history of the Vickers and Cole cases, was sufficient for the charges to hold. Prescott managed to delay the trial to the following spring, but the charges stood, and Whitmore's ability to operate in Creston County was effectively over from the day they were filed. Margaret sent a letter to the Vickers family in Nebraska, where they had resettled after losing their property. She told them what was happening, what had been discovered, and that the Marshal's investigation would likely establish the fraudulent nature of the lien that had cost them their land. She did not make promises she couldn't keep. She just told them the truth and let them know they were not forgotten. She told Ethan about the letter one evening on the porch. He looked at her. "That's going to be complicated," he said. "Legally." "I know," she said. "I'm not promising them their land back. I'm promising them that what was done to them is being acknowledged." She paused. "That's not nothing," "No," he said. "That's everything." She looked at him. He looked at her. He had been thinking about what he wanted to say for 3 weeks, since the kitchen floor, since the moment she had sat down beside Emma and put her arm around his daughter, in the way that people do things. They are no longer deciding about things, they are simply doing, because they have already decided without knowing it. "Emma told me this morning," he said, "that she is thinking of asking if she can call you something other than Margaret." A pause. "What other than Margaret?" she said, and her voice was careful. The careful of someone who is hoping for something and will not let themselves hope too openly. "She didn't tell me," Ethan said. "She wanted to ask you herself." Margaret looked at the land in front of them. Her land clear-titled hers with the fence posts Hector had cut in 1878 still standing in the Montana ground. "I see," she said. "I told her it was her choice to ask," Ethan said. "And yours to answer." "Yes." He turned toward her. "Margaret," he said, "I am asking you something too. Something separate from Emma, though it is not unrelated to Emma, because nothing about my life is unrelated to Emma, and you know that, and I think you feel the same about what she is to you." She met his eyes. "I am asking you if you will share this life with me," he said. "Not because we need each other to survive. We have both already proved we can survive. But because—" He stopped and gathered it the way you gather something you've been working out for weeks. "Because surviving was never the point. And I think we both knew that, from the night we sat on this porch, and I said, I mean to make sure you never regret opening that door." She was very still. "You never have," he said. "And I never will. And I would very much like to stop using the words I think, and probably, and someday, and say instead right now that I love you, and I am asking you to marry me. And I am asking because you are the most remarkable woman I have ever known, and because my daughter already sits on the kitchen floor with you, and I cannot imagine a future that does not have you in the center of it." The porch was quiet. Montana was very large and very still around them. Margaret looked at him for a long time. Then she said, "I was waiting for you to ask." "How long?" "Longer than I'll admit," she said. And the corner of her mouth moved, and then her whole face moved, and it was the first time Ethan had seen Margaret Hawthorne smile with her full face, without reservation, without the careful management of it, just the real thing, open and certain and completely finally unguarded. "Yes," she said. "Ethan Walker, yes." He took her hand. The spring they married was the greenest Montana had seen in years, and the people of Milford who came to the small ceremony at the church. Most of them, as it turned out, because the county had a way of remembering who stood up and who stayed quiet during the Whitmore affair, and standing up had become something people wanted to be associated with, said afterward that they had rarely seen a man look at a woman the way Ethan Walker looked at Margaret Hawthorne when she walked toward him, or a woman look at a man the way Margaret looked back. Emma stood between them during the ceremony. This had been her suggestion offered to both of them separately on the same morning, with the matter-of-fact delivery of someone presenting a logical conclusion rather than an emotional request. "I should stand between you because I'm part of this too, and also I'll need to tell you both to stop looking at each other and pay attention to the minister." She was right on both counts. The minister did at one point have to clear his throat. Hector stood in the front pew with his hat in his hands and his chin at the angle that communicated satisfaction without requiring any other expression. And when Emma, during the quietest moment of the ceremony, leaned back and whispered something to him, he whispered back, and she nodded with the decisive nod of someone whose position has been confirmed. Later, when Ethan asked what she had whispered, Emma said she had asked Hector if he thought it was going to work out, and Hector had said, "It already has." Years later, the people of Creston County still talked about Hawthorne Ranch. They talked about the widow who had held it alone through 6 hard years, and the man who had come to her gate with nothing but a sick child and an honest face, and the summer that had tested everything they had, and found at the end of every test that what they had was enough. They talked about the fence posts that proved a boundary, and the record ledger that proved a man, and the tin of money that proved what loyalty actually looks like when it has to. They talked about a little girl who named 17 chickens, and sat on kitchen floors, and stood between 2 people at an altar, and made sure they were paying attention. But what they talked about most in the particular way that small communities preserve the stories that mean something to them was this: that sometimes the things you build to survive the fences, the records, the careful documentation of every day you kept going, turn out to be the very things that save you. And sometimes the person who knocks on your door with nothing left is carrying everything you need. And sometimes the family you thought you lost forever is not the end of your story. Sometimes it is only the first chapter. And the rest of it, every hard-earned, grace-filled, fence-post solid page of it, is still ahead of you waiting to be lived.